we know what kinds of stakeholders were represented there. And yesterday we heard about productive linkages, and it had a lot to do with the mining services sector, any opportunities for manufacturing, especially the low-hanging fruit of upstream linkages in SMEs, and particularly gender dimension to SMEs, as Jesse Avadia's project, the politics of local content. How does local content and industrial linkages come into the space of national politics and competition around resource nationalism? And today, we're looking at fiscal linkages. So it's issues of revenue, taxation, redistribution, revenue management. That's obviously a very important aspect of the dimension of what resource nationalism looks like in the space of actual policy making and sometimes on a year-to-year basis when it comes to the mining fiscal regime. And it's also a very important aspect of resource nationalism, because one of the key points of argument to begin with around the commodity supercycle was the lack of revenue payback from the booming commodity markets and minerals, and the lack of actual revenue reflection of that in national treasuries. So what to do about that? And so it was one of the initial catalysts for the whole language and contestation at the political level, which emerged around resource nationalism. So this is why we're looking at fiscal linkages, because of those obvious dimensions. We're also looking at it because very particular kinds of constituencies and stakeholders are implied by fiscal linkages. So it's not just that kind of the basic conflict, which has always been there between LSM, large-scale minings, and governments around how much tax the dominant miners are going to pay, but also ASM in terms of what kinds of taxation, incentives, subsidies, forgiveness of loans, what have you, for capitalization, what kinds of things can be put in place, what demands are being made in the name of local participation under the rubric of resource nationalism. So it's ASM also appears there, but another set of constituents which haven't really been significant in the two other sectors, and that's social justice and tax justice networks, social activists who are looking for a greater redistribution of mineral revenues to fund social welfare, education, health, infrastructure, jobs, housing. So a set of constituents who aren't normally looked at in the debates around resource nationalism and mine taxation. So they're part of the constituents in our view as well. And we see them through the realm of civil society organizations. So that's the broad kind of the landscape, if you want, of fiscal linkages that we thought of, it's necessary to include through the lens of these different social constituencies. And we've kind of accommodated them in different ways through two different sub-projects. The first project, which Maya and Alex were kind of leading, was about institutional innovations. So it's fine to talk about, in boosting tax revenues, but as people who look through fiscal linkages in the building of revenues, this involves institutional innovations and investments in state capacities. So collection capacities, monitoring, renegotiating capacities around contracts, around MFRs, calibration of mining fiscal regimes and other forms of taxation, all of government approach. And that requires some central tax authorities and a tax vision. So the first project around institutional innovations is looking at what kinds of institutional investments were made in alignment with the rise of resource nationalist politics. Did that happen? What kinds of in every country there were innovations, but what were they? How effectively were they implemented? Was there a real investment or just a rhetorical investment? And what kinds of experiments and innovations were undertaken? What do we learn from them? Do we see similar patterns in the region? And what were the not best practices but interesting practices and outcomes? How do we explain that at the level of institutional investment and taxation or fiscal outcomes? That's the first project, really interesting one, and I think some great data was collected there. The second one, the second sub-project is called kind of the politics of MFR, mining fiscal regimes, or MFR dynamics. And it was really to try to get to the issue of how the political moment and relations of power within the state, and particularly economic elites, has a bearing, and sometimes a very disruptive and destabilizing bearing, even on newly formed taxation institutions. So this was a project that I was leading, and it really, in my mind, it was to try to come to terms with the kinds of issues that we were seeing in the case of Zimbabwe, where we had rapid fire changes in taxation policies, institutions, royalty rates. We saw introduction of measures and then withdrawal of them almost immediately, really ad hoc approach to developing a mining fiscal regime for the duration of the 2000s, actually, from the beginning of the 2000s until today. And so, one of the things that struck me as being a so-called Zimbabwe file or a person interested in with a deeper knowledge in Zimbabwe was how do you account for the role of politics in shifting these fundamental aspects of governmental revenue stream, particularly as mining and minerals became the dominant earner of foreign exchange. It hadn't always been in Zimbabwe, and became a really important contributor, increasingly important contributor to the GDP as commercial agriculture disappeared, more or less, and manufacturing went on a disastrous contraction slide. So mining became more and more important, both at the level of foreign exchange, not so much at the level of employment, and at the level of GDP and contribution to tax revenues, corporate income tax and royalties. So how do we account for the fact that we have this quite rapidly and strangely oscillating approach to revenue capture, and in Zimbabwe that was really about politics? So this project on MFR dynamics is about the role of politics and ad hoc or arbitrary decisions in the realm of the political on tax regimes in the mining sector. And it asks questions about, can we understand the fluctuations in taxation in Zimbabwe on the basis of looking at political competition, or looking at intra-elite fragmentation, or the encroaching and kind of centralization of executive power in the 2000s in the wake of the land reform changes and if you want, the militarization of politics in Zimbabwe. Is that one way to make sense of the strange fluctuations? So I can talk more about that after everybody else has spoken. The problem in Zimbabwe is that because politics is an issue around taxation, that it's actually very difficult to get data, very difficult to see people in government, very difficult to get straight answers from some civil society organizations or representative groups which are aligned with government. It's difficult to get a straight answer on the basis of agreed facts. It's straight answers which make sense. So our data collection from Zimbabwe for both the institutional innovations and the mining fiscal regime dynamics is relatively weak, which is unfortunate but explicable because politics is actually part of the fiscal linkages in Zimbabwe in a direct and centralized way, which it is not as much in Zambia and Tanzania. So our data from Tanzania and Zambia is richer. I guess you could say the negative data, the negative results we get from Zimbabwe are also quite rich, but it involves more speculation. So those are the two projects. Institutional innovation, I think they're quite complementary in particular circumstances of contestation. So institutional innovations, mining fiscal regime dynamics, political dynamics. And so let's hear about what we found in the region. Quite interesting data from Zambia and Tanzania. And so let's continue with Zambia and Maya, who is leading, along with Sylvia Mwamba, the research in Zambia, and Japhis, who helped to wrap up and make sense of some of the data we had collected from Nicholas Masawi, Abram Tweve, and others in Tanzania.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for the useful introduction. I think we have Sylvia online. So Sylvia, if you can get into your presentation, you have about 15 minutes, about 15 minutes to make your presentation.
Good afternoon from Zambia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah, so I'll take 30 seconds just to say hi and introduce myself. So I'm happy to be a part of this conference virtually. My name is Sylvia Mwamba. I'm one of the researchers on this study, and I'm also an affiliate at CIPA, and also working full-time at ID Insight. Thank you for this opportunity to present on the mining sector, which, as some of you already know, I think everybody involved in this study know that mining is the backbone of the Zambian economy. As a country, we are highly dependent on the mining sector, for jobs, for revenue, as well as just, for economic growth in general. So the mining sector, for example, contributes about 12% to gross domestic product, and it accounts for 70% of our export earnings and also a contributor to our domestic revenues, contributing about 30% of the total domestic revenues on average. Now, because of the importance of the mining sector, it's also not surprising that it's a hot topic in Zambia. It tends to be, for lack of a better term, also a battleground sector in Zambia, with a lot of pressure from all directions, from the mining sector, the mining firms themselves, from the political forces, from civil society. So there's always this sort of like tug of war between the different stakeholders. And the core issues really have been, how can the country maximize the mining sector's revenue potential? How can we get the most from the mining sector in terms of jobs created, in terms of economic growth? How can we get the mining sector to actually improve the lives of Zambians in general? So because of that and the need to maximize the economic benefits from the sector, we've seen a lot of maneuvers on the policy space, resulting even in the emergence of the resource nationalistic policies that we are discussing today. And for Zambia, some of these policy maneuvers have actually been reflected in inconsistencies in the mining policies, including the mining fiscal regimes. But we also see that each political party that comes in power, or each political regime, also comes with its own mining fiscal policies. So we tend to see a lot of like focus on the mining sector during the campaigns, for example. And then with a change of government, we tend to see major changes, of course, most of those centering on maximizing the revenues from the mining sector. So when we analyze the mining fiscal regimes, we'll be looking at different contexts. We'll look at the changing political landscape, and then we'll look at the commodity super cycle starting in 2006 when we saw the copper price boom. And then, of course, also looking at the institutional building aspect of it, focusing on ZRA, and then accountability mechanisms provided by the NGOs. Next slide, Maya. So this is just to show the point that I was making earlier, but to just illustrate it graphically, that you see the fluctuations, for example, in the contribution of the mining sector to total revenue, fluctuating for the most part. And then recently we started to see an uptick there with the mining contributing a little bit more to total revenue. Some of that could be attributed to some innovations that have taken place at ZRA. I think ZRA has undergone a number of innovations, including getting better at auditing the mining companies and also just beefing up their research division. I think someone made a comment in the chat. I don't know if somebody is able to look at that, but thank you for that. Then in terms of tax efficiency, it's been a challenge, an ongoing challenge, trying to maximize the revenue collections from the mining sector. And some of the challenges include, the fact that the mining companies, which tend to be big, these multinational mining companies, are always striving to minimize their tax liabilities. So they use different tax avoidance schemes, including transfer pricing, everything aimed at minimizing their taxable income. So that's what we see as a major problem. I think the ZRA is always usually behind these multinational mining companies in terms of having the tools, to avoid taxes or to minimize their tax burden. Another challenge has been just the weak institutional frameworks. So we see that there are gaps in the regulatory frameworks governing the mining sector. And these are reflected in mining tax instability. So we see that instability could be traced back to the weak regulatory frameworks. There are some innovations or reforms underway that the government is working on to strengthen the regulatory framework. One of them is the creation of a regulatory body focusing on the mining sector itself, like the way we have the Energy Regulation Board for energy. But what is also important is that between 2000 and 2019, can you go back one slide, Maya? One slide back. The next slide, please. Okay, just there. So what we see is that just between 2000 and 2019, we saw a total of about 9 changes to the mining fiscal regime. So that reflects the instabilities in the mining fiscal policies that I was talking about. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the key innovations that has taken place, which our study focused on, the institutional innovations in the mining sector, focusing on the fiscal regime. And most of those innovations were done within ZRA between 2000 and 2010, for example. And the biggest one is the creation of the large taxpayer unit. And this taxpayer unit includes the 3 components. The first one is the mining tax unit. Then we have the transfer pricing unit, and then the MVDA. What is important here to note is that these institutional innovations have been supported by different partners, including the Norwegians, GIZ, IMF, and OECD. All these have supported the different institutional innovations that we see. And the idea really has been to capacitate ZRA to better collect or maximize tax collections from the mining sector. So for example, you see the mining tax unit, that's to make sure that there's a focus on taxing the mines because they are unique. And then there's a transfer price unit, which is also focusing on making sure that ZRA is on top of the game in terms of detecting different tax avoidance schemes, including transfer pricing. Next slide. I guess this is almost where I hand over to Maya. So so Maya is gonna continue with this, but I wanted to make a note here that what we see in general with the mining sector is that the mining fiscal regimes or the mining tax policies tend to vary by political forces. So each political regime that comes in usually also makes changes to the mining sector in terms of how to maximize revenues from the sector. So Maya will take us through a number of those policies that have come with different regimes. And a key thing also is that we see that the mineral royalties have been a major center of attention and focus in terms of the policy changes. And the chart that you see to your right is just showing the composition of corporate income tax from the mining sector compared to the mineral royalties and how those have varied. You see that over time, the mineral royalties have increased in importance to the tax revenue of Zambia. So we've been seeing a lot of debates, I think, on making sure that we can capture as much as possible using the mineral royalties. So I'll let Maya take it from here. Thank you so much for your attention and your time.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia, for sticking to time. Over to you, man.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I just want to touch more. So we looked at more at institutional innovations. We're just looking more. Sylvia's an economist, I'm an historian, so we take a different angle to it. And here it's about, the kind of trajectory of resource nationalism in Zambia, and the kind of the rise, but also to some extent also the collapse or the inefficiency of resource nationalism in Zambia and the reasons for that. And so the Zambia mining sector was privatized in the 1990s. It was a national institution. So the privatization is kind of quite a recent history, which really influences the ideas on mining in Zambia. So they were privatized under really bad conditions. With the boom in 2006 of copper prices, there was a lot of pressure on introducing a better taxation, but also start improving the institutions like the Zambia Revenue Authority that Sylvia was describing. That wasn't sufficient for MMD to stay in power. Power was handed over to the Patriotic Front in 2011. Patriotic Front had already been very strong in the urban areas in the 2000s, and especially in the Copper Belt. So Copper Belt constituency in Zambia is a very important one. It's very central to the politics that we have. So here we have a second wave of resource nationalism, increase of mineral royalty tax, and all. To some extent, they continue the policies of what MMD had started, like strengthening the institutions around mineral fiscal regime, particularly the Zambia Revenue Authority. I think if we talk about resource nationalism, I think one very key issue in Zambia is the idea of national sovereignty. I think the privatization of the copper mines has really touched on the nerve of having no control over your economy and being dominated by foreign company. And like Alex has alluded to earlier, we have a very weak domestic capital class. So in politics, these issues of national sovereignty vis-a-vis the multinationals is something that comes up all the time. So it leads to public pressure in terms of the voters. I mean, in Zambia, we have a lot of electoral turnovers, so it's an important constituency. But of course, we also have public pressures through the activities of international NGOs and local NGOs. But again, that fluctuates. There are moments where they create alliances and are very strong and are able to put pressure, but they also weaken at times, and the different reasons for that, which we can go into later. In this particular time, there was also a push for more evidence-based information in the mineral value chain monitoring report, which led to some further changes in mineral royalties. However, this whole push for improving institutions, for improving the tax regime kind of got derailed in the whole process. So this technocratic coalition, where this emphasis on technocrats improving the institutions stranded. And while the capacity to audit and collect taxes from large-scale mining, you saw some results of that, but it was never really sufficient. It never got back to the earlier revenue that we used to get from the copper mines. The death of the PF President Michael Satan in 2014 then really is the end of a lot of these movements. We get a very dispersed kind of political settlement. It's very much led by factionalism. It's not to the extent of the Zimbabwe case of politicization, but it really does undermine the way we approached mineral royalty regimes, and also it affected the functioning of the revenue authority as well. It didn't collapse in any way, but it lost some of its key capacities. So a decline of professionalism, but also decline of Norwegian support. Some of the donors retreated because they just no longer could see the political will to work on those institutions without some level of political interference. Of course, crucially is the continued asymmetrical power dynamics, the uneven levels of capacity between ZRA and the large-scale mines. It's something that is just really difficult to overcome. So this raises the whole issue of the sustainability of resource national reforms in fiscal linkages. And the main argument in this paper, but also a paper I did with Alex and Cesar Chelo, is about, that these policies should be studied within the broader context and how they're impacted by electoral turnovers, the factionalism, the uneven influence of the Copper Belt constituency in Zambia, the rise and decline of NGOs, always the push between technocrats and the more political appointments, which can derail professionalism, and of course our overdependence on copper. So it really makes it difficult to respond because the mining companies have such a hold on us. I think another crucial element which we haven't really talked about is political funding. I mean, mining companies do fund political parties, and that derails some of the policies that we try to implement. That's why I want to leave the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, you stick to time. So over to you, Jeffers.
Thank you very much. I will speak on two areas: the mining fiscal regime reforms and the dynamics around that, and the institutional innovations in Tanzania. In both cases, the main point that I want to make first is that all the reforms have taken place under the tutelage of the same ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi. Tanzania has never had a regime change in terms of a change from one political party to another. So we have had all the reforms undertaken by CCM. Now, on the fiscal reforms, we have had several rounds of reforms since 2004, targeting the gemstone sector. And then again in 2006, targeting large-scale gold mining with a view of renegotiating royalties and tax rates. And then came 2009, following a major push from oppositional parties and some members of the parliament from both the opposition and the ruling party. Around 2006, 2007, 2008, with the leading opposition party holding campaign rallies across the country, exposing weaknesses in the governance of the mineral sector, and therefore pushing the government to respond. with a reviewed policy in 2009 and then a mining act in 2010, introducing reforms in taxation, in royalty rates, and for the first time introducing a free carried interest, which was pegged at 10% back then. But that had to be, the new royalty rates had to be renegotiated with the mining companies. And that was not concluded until 2014, 2015, when some deals were concluded between the government and Barrick and Anglo Gold Ashanti. And then came the bulldozer, President Magufuli, 2015, and the reforms that ensued from 2016, 2017, enactment of new laws, which introduced very strong state sovereignty requirements and new fiscal rates, and completely disturbing large-scale mining sector, but also with some reforms in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, including, for example, the elimination of 18% value-added tax in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, and the elimination of 5% withholding tax, the reduction of fees paid to firefighting authority from 6 million shillings to 200,000 shillings, which together, these measures from the perspective of artisanal and small-scale miners themselves, they have helped reduce the challenge of smuggling, gold smuggling, mineral smuggling, because they say paying government taxes is now cheaper than smuggling. And then we had also, around that same time, the negotiations between the government of Tanzania and Barrick, which took about 4 years before they were concluded, and they centered around Acacia not paying taxes, having declared or evaded paying taxes. And so the government had slammed Acacia with $190 billion tax bill, which across the negotiations came down to $300,000 million, which Barrick accepted to pay, and in 3 tranches. And the negotiations were concluded in 2020, early 2020, resulting in a joint venture company run by the government, co-run by the government of Tanzania and Barrick, and also an agreement for a 50-50 share of economic benefits, where the 50% of economic benefits to Tanzania would be in terms of royalties, taxes, and the 16% interest rate, free carried interest rate. Now, what is interesting there is that the 16% free carried interest is not final. There is it's still open-ended that it can even go up to 50% if the government of Tanzania decides to capture the costs it incurs in infrastructure, for example, putting in place infrastructure to support mining activities, and in tax holidays, reductions to miners. So if all those can be taken into consideration, then the government would claim up to 50% of interest. And in brief, if we look at all these from 2004 to 2020. What have been the dynamics behind these fiscal reforms? One, like in the case of Zambia, competitive electoral politics have been decisive. The opposition parties have gained some popular support over the past 10 or so years, and especially from around 2005 to 2015, they were very vocal, and Chama cha Mapinduzi was threatened. In 2015, Chama cha Mapinduzi's performance in presidential elections was the lowest since independence, and it was even lower than 2010. 2010 was also lower, and opposition parties were gaining more members of parliament from constituencies. So there was a lot happening in terms of electoral politics pushing for these reforms. But on the popular side, you had people complaining that the country and themselves are not getting enough from their minerals being extracted. But again, you had the political and economic significance of the Atsalo and small-scale mining sector, which employs many more Tanzanians, estimated at 1.5 million employed directly. And like I have said, all these reforms have taken place under Chama cha Mapinduzi, the same party, but Chama cha Mapinduzi is divided ideologically. Its constitution says it is a socialist party, which believes in ujamaa na kujitegemea, socialism and self-reliance. But in practice, you get a combination of socialists within the same party and liberalists in the same party. So we have had that change of presidents. At one time, you get a socialist-leaning president like we had with President Magufuli. The other time, you get a liberal-leaning president like we have with President Samia and like we had with President Kikwete. So that in itself has kept the ball rolling. And finally, you have the legislative processes which have tended to be conducted under a certificate of urgency. We have never had any major reform in Tanzania in the mining sector, which was undertaken in a regular process where the bill would be tabled in parliament and debated for some time. Since 1998, all the reforms have been undertaken under a certificate of urgency where the bill would be presented and debated in a day or two and then passed into a law. And then after some time, you come back to realize that you made mistakes. And so we end up having unstable regulatory and legislative regime. In terms of the institutional innovations, two key institutions which have been born out of resource nationalism. One, which was established in 2009, the Tanzania Minerals Audit Agency. And as the name indicates, to audit mineral activities, the production of minerals, export of minerals, and to determine royalty amounts and collect the same. Now, this was slammed by President Magufuli on an understanding that it was colluding with large-scale miners to deny Tanzania of its needed revenues. And therefore, it was abandoned in 2017 and replaced with the Mining Commission, which does a whole lot of, performs a whole lot of functions from licensing to revenue collection, non-tax revenue collection to management of resident mines offices and mine resident offices. and so forth, and the management also of mineral trading centers spread across the country. Now, I think the Mining Commission could be said to have been a game changer in Tanzania's mining sector in terms of the innovations that have come out of it, including the trading centers and the revenues, the amounts of revenues that are being collected by the same non-tax revenues, which have kept on increasing. And also in the issuance of licenses. Yes, and like Chris said yesterday, there haven't been any major issuance of large-scale mining licenses for the past 10 or 15 years, until last year when 2 large-scale mining licenses were issued for the critical minerals for graphite and rare earths. But there have been more and more licenses have been issued in the primary mining sector, the small-scale mining sector, and in the medium mining sector. Yes, in terms of the functioning, probably another innovation that we can briefly say on the Mining Commission is the composition of its commissioners. Where do they come from? Majority of them are from the government. So currently, it has members including the Deputy Attorney General, the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Defense and the National Service. That says a lot about about how the government sees the commission itself and what it wants to achieve from it. Then the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Human Settlements, the Permanent Secretary from the Treasury, the Permanent Secretary from Ministry for Local Government, and interestingly, the Chief Executive Officer from the Federation of Miners Association of Tanzania. It's a federation of small-scale mining associations. She also sits in the Mining Commission, and 2 persons with proven knowledge and expertise in mining. In terms of whether the Mining Commission has adequate institutional capacity, that's a challenge. It does a lot, but it is one, understaffed in terms of expertise, 2, underfunded. It collects lots and lots of revenues, but nothing goes back to it.
Jeffers, you have 5 minutes to finish.
Yes, and finally, and like I hinted before, the Mining Commission has been central to Tanzania's revenue collection from the mining sector, from the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, and from the voices of the people we interviewed. There is an agreement that revenue collection have increased, and there has been strengthened administration of mineral taxation in Tanzania, and the establishment of gold markets or mineral markets has reduced to a large extent the smuggling of minerals, and the government can now easily collect a tax. But that's for Tanzania. Like I said 2 days ago, smuggling may have been reduced in Tanzania, but we don't know what that means to the neighboring countries. And 2 days ago, I noted that there's been a new revenue stream coming from these innovations, which is coming revenues generated from the mineral trading centers. And I mentioned it 2 days ago that between 2019 and 2023, Tanzania collected $220 million from the trading centers. This is a new revenue stream. I believe it can do a lot if it is reinvested in improving the sector. I will leave it there. I will be happy to answer questions and discuss more. Thank you.
Jed.
Right. I'm going to speak briefly to the questions and fairly light research we were able to do around the mining fiscal regime changes in Zimbabwe. The project on institutional innovations and reforms was almost impossible to do. I've repeated visits with Lyman, myself, Peter to ministries. I think we ended up actually interviewing one person twice in Majlo. But, after undertakings and letters and invitations from high authorities within the Ministry of Finance over 2 years, still didn't get to see people and put off again and again and again. And I have to say the same kind of obfuscation and blockage happened from some associations, including the Chamber of Mines, which used to be accessible and which is less accessible than it used to be. And this is really a reflection of the shifting political terrain and the sensitivities around the growing mineral revenue economy and its importance to government and to the political leadership. In the end, for the Mining Fiscal Regime Project, we interviewed 3 civil society officers, 3 executives of large-scale mining companies, 1 official twice, Lyman Solomon and Peter Kanetsa and I saw him. And no interviews with the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, which is the central authority mandated to collect most mineral taxes, most but not all. So it was very difficult, and much of the documentation we have are things that were easily collectible before. We've collected in other places through our various work, and our speculations about how to understand certain changes were more or less confirmed by the few interviews that we were able to do. It was quite a frustrating project, particularly compared to the kind of access which our projects had in Tanzania and Zambia. The lay of the land overall is, on the basis of available documentation and what we know about policymaking in Zimbabwe is kind of points in the direction of the conclusions already. And the first is that, there's been a big debate around, led by the state, around mining policy, a strategy for the mining sector, which, by the mid-2000s, first decade of the 2000s, was the most important growing sector. And particularly in the context, in the wake of the indigenization program, it's the main sector which continued to be dominated by foreign actors. Most mining in Zimbabwe, it's mechanized mining, is dominated by historically the legacy of large-scale mining. First, American and British, some Australia, and then in the 2000s, many of those were taken over by Chinese and a few South Asian and new Canadian actors, but generally foreign dominated. There's been a transition in ownership, but has not been towards most Zimbabweans until recently. It's been towards other foreign players. So debates around mining policy since 2007, I think, was the first draft, which was put out there for public consultation, have been going on about how to manage and restructure this in the context of a restructured economy. There is still no mining policy in Zimbabwe. The debates have led to nothing. There have been initially during the period of government of national unity, after the contested 2008 elections, there was a lot of openness and stakeholder engagement funded by donors and engaged in with a state in which power was shared between the ZANU-PF and the opposition MDC at that time. So a lot of debates, but There's been no settlement around what a basic strategy for mining looks like. So there is no rubric by which to develop incentives and coordinated efforts around things like a mining fiscal regime or mine ownership, which also has implications for mining fiscal regime. So part of the research that was done was funded in 2009-10 by the UNDP as part of the, renewing Zimbabwe and in an era of democratization. There was an excellent study by Tony Hawkins, commissioned by the UNDP, extensive evidence-based research and recommendations around calibration of tax rates and investment environment. None of that was taken up. In 2012, a study funded by donors but commissioned by the Ministry of Mines over in Mpofu. It's commissioned from South African expert and Zimbabwean experts, Chikamira, Paul Jordan, and others. And it was really impressive, deeply researched, widely aware of African experiences in mining sector reform. That was produced, became a document for public discussion in 2012. Nothing happened. 2006, 2008, something did happen. It was Marangi Diamonds, the world's largest diamond rush since Kimberley, in 50 years, actually, not Kimberley, but since in 50 years in terms of the value of diamonds. And that kind of through debates and calibration of mining policy, especially around taxation receipts and what to do with the billions of dollars that came in, at least 2 billion went missing, probably more. That threw off track the attention of government and agreement amongst different ministries in government of exactly how to proceed, whether to bureaucratize, normalize, and regularize a fiscal policy around mineral taxation, or to actually use this as a smash and grab. And unfortunately, as we well know with Marangi, especially once the government of national unity came in 2009 and the Minister of Finance became a member of the opposition, was a member of the opposition, we know that the financial flows from Marangi simply weren't there. There was huge disputes about what was actually produced and what actually came into government revenues. There was the revelation of secret contracts and zero tax agreements with two of the largest miners in the diamond sector, one Chinese engine, the other Mbali, which was a joint venture of people connected with the ruling party in South Africa. So the lure of instant cash, of a lottery win funded by diamonds, and disagreements within the state, within ZANU-PF first, and then within the government of national unity about what a viable, normalized, regular fiscal policy would look like around the last man standing, the mineral sector in the economy. That led to kind of a fragmentation of thinking and lots of debate, but no action around mining. This was really accentuated in the period of the government of national unity between ZANU-PF and the MDC in 2009 to 2013. There's a lot of rising tax jurisdiction fragmentation. More and more institutions within the state and different ministries had obtained a jurisdiction to collect tax, and there was a decentralization of accounting for tax revenues. So I think in the end, there were like 12 or 13 different state authorities which were mandated to collect taxes in different ways, and disputes over which part of mineral collection they should have. There was a Mineral Marketing Commission responsible for exports. There was a Ministry of Finance, but including the RBZ, Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, which is the sole buyer of gold in Zimbabwe. There was the ZMDC, the Zimbabwe Mineral Mining Development Company, which was a corporation which is also responsible for registering and partial taxation of mines. There's rural district councils, which were given in 2013 the right to tax minerals in their own location. Road authorities, electricity authorities, water authorities, environmental management authorities, another realm of taxation, all of it actually feeding or allowing parts of the bureaucracy to survive off of one of the few remaining sectors which was able to pay tax. because it was an export-oriented set of productions. So in sum, this period of the 2000s, period of fiscal crisis of the state, fragmentation of a vision of how the state should proceed to, normalize a destabilized economy. All of this led to really strong intrastate conflict within ZANU-PF and then within the government of national unity around this lucrative asset of mining. And at that point, there was a deliberate sidelining of tax authorities and administrative authorities within the Ministry of Mines, and increasing volatility in the mining fiscal regime, making it unpredictable, debureaucratized, and with management of the revenue stream becoming more and more obtuse and untransparent to the public. We saw a lot of innovations, but they were fleeting and sometimes contradictory in the mining fiscal regime. In 2005, for example, as an attempt to get a hold of ASM gold, which was rising in the wake of an economic and livelihoods crisis, a presumptive tax was introduced. So although ASM miners might not have been legally registered and were paying on a regular basis, it was presumed if they were found that they were earning such and such and that they'd have to pay a presumptive tax in advance. That was later dropped without announcement and without planning. There was the introduction of royalties and VAT in the early 2000s. Royalties had always been there, but they hadn't been enforced. All of a sudden, royalties become enforced, but then they start to change very, very rapidly and unpredictably in order to meet the short-term fiscal crisis of the state, which was in free fall. So you have, for example, royalties on the high-value mechanized production of gold and platinum, changing very rapidly and becoming extremely uncompetitive. Between 2009 and 2012, a period of relative stability within the state. Under a ZANU-PF Minister of Mines, royalty rates changed at least 5 times in 3 years. There were other ways of gathering revenue, which were we call them quasi-fiscal royalties, around from 2006 on, and the introduction of various means to retain forex earned by miners and a mixes of payments of royalty, so that a black market rate for foreign exchange was actually used, and so the miners actually had to pay more than a third, sometimes double of what the royalty would be because of the currency in which it had to be paid and the crisis of inflation in the Zimbabwe dollar. So that was another form of unpredictable ad hoc fiscal measures. In 2023, to wind forward, there were lots of these things introduced. Threat of a ban on the export of platinum matte unless windfall taxes were paid was suspended. It's never actually been put in place, but it did extract occasional payments, ad hoc payments from the large-scale platinum exporters. And these kind of a series of ad hoc measures, uncoordinated, without warning, and sometimes announced by the president without the Minister of Mines knowing about it or saying they didn't know about it, about the platinum exports, for example. It continues up until now. In 2023, there was this statutory instrument introduced for gold, diamond, and PGMs and lithium, the main export quantities now in high-value minerals, and uniquely, the royalty would now be paid 50% in ore, in kind, which means the government would have access to the stocks. There was no provisions made for warehousing, for assaying, and figuring out what the ore quality was like, because most of it is not refined. It's only semi-processed. None of those plans were made. Out of the blue, it's announced. And one Zimbabwe expert described it as, on television, as being unique, which I thought was an extremely generous way to describe this harebrained scheme, which is not used elsewhere. 50% paid in ore or in kind, some of the rest of that paid in forex, and the rest paid in Zimbabwe dollars. Very complicated, really unenforceable and unmanageable in the end, but nonetheless, the kind of thing that's raised. Why would you do this with the royalty? It's asked. One of the obvious answers would be so that you have access to ore, which can then be sold at a quietly negotiated price to different markets and bidders by who knows whom within the ministry. So these kinds of changes, all the way up to 2023, in a sector which has been dominant now, more than 60% of foreign exchange earnings, has introduced quite a high level of volatility to revenue streams, to predictability, and you can imagine what it's done to the investment environment in terms of large-scale foreign direct investment, which Zimbabwe's mining sector needs in order to grow. In our consultations, in our interviews, we asked about these things with civil society organizations, with large-scale mining representatives, and asked, how do you make sense of this? And to what extent has there been consultation of stakeholders, which has always been promised by government, and the minister is always saying that they're consulting people. In fact, right now, they're meeting the annual general meeting of the Zimbabwe Chamber of Mines, and the minister is there as a special guest saying that they're consulting. There's one civil society organization there only. Nobody else can afford the fees, but it's mainly large scale and some foreign miners engaging in public handshakes and endorsing a mining fiscal regime, which is actually quite malleable to their needs, around which many of the contracts are actually not transparently known in terms of the full deals and the tax and fiscal implications of them. It's a win-win situation in some regards. Through ad hoc measures, government can fill fiscal gaps which emerge, and mining companies have a fairly good sense of what they can get away with. Tax loopholes around illicit financial transfers have been closed in principle legally, but the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms for supervising and monitoring them are not there. A government official, the one government official we spoke with, confirmed what civil society interviews told us, that government really doesn't consult very much. Government says it consults, but it consults when it brings people to tell them what the latest mining fiscal regime changes are about. Questions about inclusivity that we raise, does government do something to reach stakeholders like ASM to bring them into discussion around MFR to see how to incentivize them? We don't see that kind of thing. Nobody has mentioned that they feel consulted, that they feel listened to, and even parliamentarians are told that they don't have much deliberative function, even though there is a parliamentary subcommittee on mining and minerals and another on taxation. They don't feel consulted. There's generally, for parliamentarians, for civil society organizations, and even apparently with large-scale miners, a lack of data available. The kind of data that you'd expect to see. We ourselves have tried to find out through the single gold buyer, the legal gold buyer, Fidelity Printers, which is a subsidiary, had been a subsidiary of the Reserve Bank. We tried to find out where the gold is coming from. We know that as the sole buyer of gold, Fidelity knows who the small-scale miners are who are producing, the large-scale, and the artisanals. That information, which on the basis of which you make fiscal policy around the mining fiscal regime in order to maximize efficiencies, that information is not publicly available, not known, and good luck in getting it. So the outcomes, we know what these are. There's investor confidence, declining performance in terms of environment, in terms of Zimbabwe's competitive standing for one of the world's top platinum sources. This is a real problem. For one of the world's top 10 lithium producers, that's a problem. It means that the kinds of deals that are made and the taxation revenues come out of it are weak, much less efficient, and much less transparent and manageable, supervisable than they could be. It means that overall the revenue streams from the singular largest source of Forex is uncertain, unpredictable, changes from time to time. You have gold production rising and dropping by matters of tons, not on the basis of production, but on the basis of fiscal incentives for those who are producing gold. Whether it gets smuggled or not is a matter of tax compliance, mostly in Zimbabwe. And you have, a myth put to the issue of the promised $12 billion economy of minerals, which we heard about under the Second Republic as being the way forward. Minerals will drive the way forward in Zimbabwe, and revenue from minerals will do that. $12 billion economy. $12 billion is probably being produced. The taxation is not coming there. Where is it going? And if the taxation revenues do come, what is happening with them? The Sovereign Wealth Fund, now been renamed, is effectively empty. The future, which is meant to be coming from current relatively high revenue streams in the mineral sector, which we expect are there, is increasingly uncertain and obscured. And again, I think will become a matter of political contestation under the rubric of a new kind of resource nationalism going forward. Led by whom, we don't know, but it's an inescapable, inescapable point of political debate, especially in the wake of 20 years of contestation over these oscillating, untransparent revenue flows from minerals.
Thank you, Richard, for that. I just wanted, coming from Zimbabwe, I just wanted to make also just a few points. On the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, capacity, I think we have gathered that there's limited, human resources and technical skills to deal with the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, especially looking at the issue of opacity of that sector, and also to deal with the large corporates in terms of addressing the profit-shifting tendencies, thin capitalization. You have transfer pricing, you have re-invoicing, and also the issue of multiplicity of the mining fiscal regime, which makes it complicated to actually administer. I think, Richard, you have spoken to the issue of consultation, that actually it was indicated by a government official that as a matter of practice, the government doesn't consult the people, but there are intra-governmental consultations between departments of government, and then they come up with a policy, they announce. Then the consultation sort of comes after the reactions of the, of companies, reactions of stakeholders. Then that is what then they would call consultation. But these are really reactions. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that while we have a well-capacitated CSO, constituency, it deals basically with the transparency, issues of taxation transparency, efficiency, but the government sensitivity to critical voice and alternative voices has impeded, implementation of anything that comes from that, from that side. So those are the points that I just wanted to add to what Richard has said. Another round of applause for our panelists. We go into question and answer session. Any questions to any of the panelists? Including, we have Sylvia online. Yeah? Or is about to leave? Okay.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. I'd like to pick up on Jaffe's observation that the Mineral Trading Center generated $22 million, and what you mentioned, it could be reinvested into the sector. Picking up on the question of the allocation, I was curious to know, I think Richard has answered for Zimbabwe, but for the case of Tanzania and Zambia, do guiding principles exist as to how mining revenue is to be allocated towards social services And is there interministerial discussion of this kind of where should go to align ministerial policies and objectives with the mass of mining revenue? Or is the situation similar to what we have seen in Mali and Senegal, a single coffer, little knowledge about how it's used, lack of coordination among the ministries to align their declarations with the existence of the issue of management of mining revenue? Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie, for the question. The Tanzanian political economy system with regard to mining is complicated. There is that understanding government position is that revenues coming from mining belong to all Tanzanians. And so all these revenues are collected and then dumped into the central fund. And then the allocation of the same, there is no way you can determine how much of the revenues from mining went where. So there is no that arrangement. It's resources pulled together and then distributed in just like any other revenues. So we don't have that in Tanzania. There is a certain arrangement with revenues coming from other natural resources other than minerals. So for example, from wildlife, where there is an arrangement for a certain amount, for a certain proportion to remain to communities where tourist activities take place. That does not work for the mining sector. So briefly, we don't have a specific arrangement for that. And that's why I said the Mining Commission collects revenues, submits to the government, and in return, there is that same amount does not come back to the commission. These revenues are collected from artisanal and small-scale mining, the ones I mentioned, the non-tax revenues. But they don't get back to the sector, the small-scale sector, for its improvement.
Yeah, I would say the same for Zambia. It goes to one place. In the 2015 mineral code, there was a suggestion of a local allocation that some money would remain for the communities, like a 5%. That was never implemented and reversed later on. I think it creates tensions because especially with the expectations people have towards social welfare coming from the mining companies, that comes from the history of Zambia, where welfare was such an important aspect. So now people don't know what's coming from a company in terms of CSR, what's supposed to come from government. So on the ground, you can see communities being confused about who's supposed to build a road, who's supposed to build a clinic, and then the companies say like that's done through taxation. And so there's kind of push and pull going on the ground. And sometimes mining companies have to jump in because of local discontent about the absence of these services. But it's very ad hoc and not prescribed.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Okay. Jaface, you said a really interesting point here, which I'm going to take and put into another context. But you mentioned that with the Tanzanian reforms, especially to small-scale mining, small-scale miners, something clicks, and it's like it's cheaper to pay the taxes than to smuggle. So the tax regime becomes maybe cheaper and simpler. Government revenue shoots up. Yeah, I'm not here arguing that the Laffer curve works in every situation, but there is evidence that when you can simplify a tax code or the ability to simplify, even reduce the rates, it's cheaper for government to actually, you're not trying to overcome the smuggling problem. You're just collecting the taxes, and your tax rates go up and you spend less money on surveillance, monitoring, etc. People get into the sector. It becomes easier to monitor. It becomes easier in terms of formalization. So I'm going to take this up to the next level, which is, again, LSMs. Why do they spend so much money on transfer pricing and evasion of the corporate tax, etc.? It's sometimes because the corporate tax levels in two countries, Zambia particularly, but also Tanzania, for corporates in general, are really quite high comparatively internationally. So in Tanzania, I was just reading up, you mentioned the graphite mines. One of the graphite miners who signed an agreement recently got a 10-year tax holiday plus all of these other tax things under Magufuli, right? This is before 2021, because that's the only way that it's going to become competitive for a miner to actually consider doing a project. So you can have all of these high tax rates, but then you get into discretionary negotiations, case after case. And in my mind, that sort of ends up stimulating resource nationalism when you say, well, this international company just got a 10-year tax break. So instead of having all of these high levels that then are negotiated down on a case-by-case basis, sometimes if you just reduce it and simplify it, there's less discretion. It's very clear, and the companies won't spend all this time and effort trying to avoid the taxation level. So the question is there any? I know on a resource nationalism approach, reducing tax rates would go against just the intuitive feeling, but it would potentially increase revenue and make it simpler and less and more clear. So is there any movement in terms of the technocrats, the taxation folks, the people that know, that are involved in this in Tanzania or Zambia? Zimbabwe for me is a whole nother case. Is there any sense of that within CSOs? I'm not even talking about the mining industry, CSOs, mining, accounting, technocrats that have ever argued for lowering tax rates to simplify it and to make them more transparent? I guess that's my question.
Thanks, Chris. In Tanzania, that discussion is not there. It's not there. It's not in the civil society. The civil society sector is basically might even be more resource nationalist than the state itself. It's not, the discussion is neither in the government. For the artisanal and small scale mining sector, it was possible because of what I already said, the way President Magufuli positioned the sector as an important one politically and constituting voters. So he called them and held talks and discussions with them. And these ideas came from the miners themselves. So the government just implemented, making it much, much, much easier for the government to collect more revenues and have a bit efficient system of managing the sector. For the large scale, and given that general perception, general popular and official perception about large scale miners as exploiters, looters, that may not be forthcoming.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have come to the end of our, yeah. Oh, okay, one response.
On the Zambia case. Yeah, of course, we've got a change with UPND coming into power, which is more a liberal party and did make significant concessions, well, made some concessions on the tax regime. But, you know, it's done in a time when there's huge fiscal pressure with the debt crisis going on. So the pressure points will be high on them. I think the same for Tanzania. I think the population is more resource nationalistic than the government itself. And to maintain support from the copper belt kind of constituency, I think will be very difficult to shift that very radically. Civil society, I think technically they're quite weak. So in general, we don't get many advanced kind of suggestions from them. I think, you know, if we're going back to the debate yesterday about degeneration, then of course it becomes a whole different debate about what are we being left in and left with. And in that sense, people feel, you know, you still have debates on social media like let's leave it in the ground because we're seeing the damage of it, which is very difficult to handle. So the whole range of debates going on there.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Last round of applause to our intelligent panelists. I think we've managed to meet our time marginally. We missed it marginally, but I think we did well. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for being here for the final, but certainly not the least panel in terms of its significance and importance, because I think it's apposite that we have a panel on social movements, community advocacy, and resource subnationalisms. And to that effect, we're fortunate to have 4 panelists. Regrettably, I think one of the panelists is not with us today. Adibuishi Adinaran from Obafemi Awolowo University, which is regrettable because I think it would have been good to have heard from one of Africa's most important countries in terms of a resource course. But in any event, we have 5 other panelists, one here with me, Omar Farouk from the University of New Brunswick, who's going to be talking about resource nationalism, energy politics, and social movements in Bangladesh. Online, we also have Cesar Apenatik and Maddie Fleming from the University of Calgary doing Unveiling the Dynamics of Resource Nationalism, a case study of mining in Ghana's Upper East region. And they're going to go first because of logistical reasons. And also online, 2 people speaking to and about and from Indonesia, Raras Kayo Fitri and Nanang Indira Kumwan from the Universitas Gadjah Mada, Local Politics, Resource Nationalism, a Narrative, an Insight from Meta Putin Discourse in Tin Mining in Bangka Belitung in Indonesia. If I can just quickly do a kind of rapid bio of the participants today. Madeline Fleming is a senior undergraduate student from the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. I think it is important to hear younger, fledgling voices in these discussions. Her research interests include African politics, international relations, and conflict analysis. She's a research assistant in the Department of African Studies and Global Development Studies, working with Dr. Roland Cesar Apenatik, and she examines the historical evolution of current manifestations and future considerations regarding the complex nature of resource nationalism and its implications on mining activity in the Upper East region of Ghana, a site that many of you through the conference have realized is a really important historical location for the discussions of resource nationalism. Omar is an assistant teaching professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. He earned his PhD from the University of Toronto with a focus on globalization, resource extraction, and social movements. Between 2019 and 21, Dr. Farouk was a Shirk postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Global Development, studies at Queen's University. His broader research interests are positioned in the intersection of political sociology, environmental sociology, with a focus on contentious politics and social movements, sustainable energy, future resource development, environmental governance, and climate politics. Oh, thank you. Dr. Farouk is a member of the working group on national resources, energy, and climate obstruction in the Global South, led by the Climate Social Science Network, CSSN at Brown University. I'll reintroduce Raris and Dr. Nanani Indira a little bit later. So perhaps we can begin with the first presentation starting now. Thank you. Madeleine and Cesar.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And you know, I want to take the opportunity to briefly thank the organizers for inviting us to present this research. It's a research we just started towards the end of last year. So I'm currently in the field trying to still collect data. So we will move on to talk a bit about mining in the Upper East region. Maddie, can you move the slides, please? Okay. So we'll be looking at the historical context, the case study, and move on to talk about the environmental, social, government policy, and lesson learned and conclusions. So I will do the first 3 levels, the historical context. As many of you may be aware, what is called Ghana today was during the colonial era called the Gold Coast. And the reason is that gold was synonymous with Ghana. Everywhere in Ghana, along the coast and everywhere, you could easily see gold. So Ghana was then the Gold Coast. And gold did not begin with the colonial era. If you look back, the Trans-Sahara trade involved the transport of gold and other materials. And people were wondering where the gold was coming from. So there was actually a lot of gold in many parts of Ghana. So during the colonial era, the focus was on the southern sector, and this is not changed after independence. Until just last year, 5 or 10 years ago, people began to discover or talk about gold in their Upper East region or the northern part. And to give you another context, there is a cultural complex called the Koma culture, C-O-M-A. And in the Koma culture is supposed to be dated back to the 12th, 14th century AD. And most of the terracottas we found associated with the Koma culture were made with gold dust. So there were questions about where the gold is coming from. So what I'm trying to say is that in terms of historical context, history of gold has always been there in the northern part. And that's why we are seeing Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger becoming a very important areas when we talk of mining. So in the last 10 years, there had been exploration in the Upper East region, particularly around a place called Tongo. So Tongo is, can you go to the map? Tongo is made up of a number of, it's a district made up of a number of towns. And as you can see on the map, there are about 5 towns that have already been identified as having viable areas to exploit. And I have been to the field. The last time I visited there was 2 weeks ago, and what I was hearing is that the Tongo mines, these mines are supposed to be the second largest rich mines in West Africa. So that tells you the story. And the historical context tells you that not far from the Tongo mine, there was a mine up there, I don't know whether you can see it, called the Nangode mine. And that was during the post-colonial era, they attempted to mine there. So basically, to give you a context, gold mining is beginning to play an important and also significant role in the lives of the people of the Upper East region. So there may be other minerals that are associated with mining in the Upper East, but so far, gold mining is the most important. So, and we have a number of foreign investors there now. Mostly the Chinese are there. And we also have the Yenga mining, which is probably mined by a conglomeration of domestic investors. So some of the mining companies have established community engagement programs to build positive relationships with the local people. From what we are seeing, unfortunately, the land acquisition terrain or land ownership within the Upper East region is more complex than many other parts of the world, many parts of Ghana, especially in the southern part. Land is owned and controlled by mostly chiefs and so forth. But in the Upper East region, land is owned by individual families. So the first conflict that we are seeing is this push between individual families and the chief trying to usurp powers and so forth and to give these lands out, even though licenses for operating have to come from government, the social license from the people will have to come from the community. And as I said, the community is so complex and devised to such a way that there is a pull and push going on. And so far, the government has not really come out with a clear policy on how to resolve this. Theoretically, you hear people talking about community engagement. What does it mean? And most what I've seen so far is engagement with chiefs and community leaders. And most chiefs don't even own the land. And therefore, that is creating a lot of tension. Can you move on, please? Madi? Yeah. So, given the historical background, what I would do is I will leave this for Madi to continue from there. So, Madi.
Okay, so I'm going to be very quickly outlining some of the impacts and policies that have been seen in the Upper East region, as well as policies implemented in Ghana as a whole. So I'll quickly go over, because I feel that local employment is probably, for the sake of time, very important to address. So the mining industry has provided a lot of employment for locals, and it has potential to generate a very significant socioeconomic development. Across Ghana, 1 million people are directly employed by artisanal small-scale mining, and triple that indirectly. The gold production by artisanal small-scale miners has been increasing throughout the last 20 years and has reached national production levels of up to 43% in the last 10 years. And the interest in small-scale mining in particular has increased due to mainly the high price of gold, but also the reduction of other livelihood choices, especially in rural areas. And the small-scale mining sector in particular has employed a lot of young people, and it attracts a lot of rural young people. And in an area like the Tilensi district, that is 84% rural population, this is very important. And generally, these youth will rely on agriculture for their main source of income. However, they're increasingly moving towards small-scale mining because agriculture has not become as lucrative, and farmlands have been increasingly destroyed as a result of other mining activities. So it has considerable potential to generate benefits. However, as of 2021, 56% of people in the Tillensi region do experience multidimensional poverty. So it hasn't created that benefit that could be theoretically seen yet. And I'll move on to discuss the social impact. So conflict and displacement has been a result of particularly what is called galamsey, illegal mining. It's a local term derived from the phrase gather then sell. And it refers to illegal gold mining. And several presidents over the past 10 years have tried to eliminate illegal gold mining using military means. And this has resulted in several clashes of illegal miners with military police. In 2021, Operation Halt 2 was implemented. And recently this year, there was a clash against military personnel and illegal miners when illegal miners had dug holes connecting to a major mine's concessions. And it resulted in 2 young miners being shot and killed and critically injured several others. And community development has resulted from mining companies investing in local infrastructure. Unfortunately, this is seen often as a result of communities having to be relocated from mining ventures. So Cardinal Namdini recently relocated 2 communities in 2022 and developed new infrastructure and social communities for them. However, many locals have expressed their displeasement with this relocation because of the loss of livelihood. They relied on illegal mining and shea butter trees that had to be cut down, and they no longer have that means of income. And the environmental degradation, I'm sure, has been discussed quite a bit. But in an area that is largely rural and dependent on farmland, it is particularly important. And it has resulted in soil erosion and heavy metal contamination in water. And the Ghanaian government has tried to implement several regulatory bodies and policies to kind of alleviate this environmental harm. However, most of it has been majorly ineffective. And as a result, farmland continues to be destroyed, and many people in the Tillensi district have been injured or died as a result of these malpractices. However, one promising scheme that has come up is the community mining scheme that the Ghanaian government has begun to introduce into some communities. That is supported and implemented by the Minerals Commission and offers a greater community insight into mining, equipped with a code of practice and mine support for workers. So not only will it generate jobs, but it will create greater training structures so that miners are trained in proper practices, and therefore less destruction to the environment will result. And then I guess for the sake of time, I will move on quickly to the government policies. So several content policies have been implemented for local content policies that mandate that mining companies have to use local content and local workers when they are operating. So despite this, many youth in the Tillensi district have complained that mining companies are reluctant to hire them, and thus they result to the informal sector instead. I will mention as well quickly that the Minerals Development Fund Act says that 20% of mineral royalties received by the Ghanaian government is intended to provide financial resources to mining communities to redress the harmful effects of mining on these communities. However, it is very unclear of how this is actually implemented at the local level, and more work probably needs to be done to create more local involvement at the district level to ensure that development is actually happening. And relative to international national control, recently the Green Minerals Policy that will amend the Mining and Minerals Policy of 2014 enables the government to reap greater benefits on not gold, but green minerals with increased royalties so that they can effectively implement development programs and take advantage of those high prices. And the lessons learned, so balancing interests is always going to be very important throughout the country, but particularly in an area like Tongo, where a lot of the community is rural and depends on local governance. It is increasingly important to take into consideration local communities and their needs, as well as the demands of foreign investors. Largely in the region, the government has prioritized the needs of foreign investors and not taken into consideration local contexts, which has created quite a bit of conflict, as Caesar had said. For sustainable practices, not only including environmental practices, but social and economic as well, to create livelihoods that are sustainable and do not create harm to the environment and will create lasting subsistence rather than just temporary means of income. And continued policy and research and development, it's very important to address the ever-evolving section that is the artisanal mining sector, because it is quite ever-changing and an area that is rural and will have various impacts as a result of climate change, local governance shifts. It is important to take into consideration local leaders and local communities. And so resource nationalism in Tongo presents opportunities and challenges. And to look into the past is very important to implement these policies that will create a sustainable change at the local level. And if they are not implemented, this trend of very disconnected governance policies that aren't effective will continue. So that is the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cesar and Maddie, and especially for the overview and staying within time as well. We're next going to turn to Omar, who is going to speak to resource nationalism, energy politics, the social movements in Bangladesh.
Okay, so thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the issues that I'm researching currently. So it's completely a different topic, far away from the key focus area, geographic region in Africa. So I'm taking you with me to South Asia. So I start with this image that I've collected from an issue of The Economist published in 2012, which shows precious metal, mineral, whatever that is, and the title of the short article is "Wish You Were Mine." So I guess that's something that drives the activists in Bangladesh who have been mobilizing popular campaigns, mobilizations, contesting government's energy and resource extraction policies since the late 1990s. So I'll talk about some of the issues that they been dealing with in the past several years in Bangladesh, and to what extent they achieved some sort of successes, or I would say not so much successes in terms of dealing with major policy transformation in Bangladesh's energy and resource sector. So I'll just briefly highlight some key issues vis-a-vis resource nationalism. I'm sure all of you are familiar with these issues, so I'll just repeat some of the stuff that has already been mentioned. So the state, some key issues in resource nationalism literature is like this: state and corporate capital have antagonistic relationship vis-a-vis resource nationalism, which refers to increased control of the state over natural resource management, which market fundamentalists broadly consider as a threat to the principles of a free market economy. And existing scholarship is dominated by narrow economic concerns in terms of fiscal resource nationalism, although I would not say that less attention is paid to political dynamics that shape states' resource nationalist policies. In recent years, we see a growing literature emphasizing political processes, political dynamics to understand complex, multiple layered processes associated with resource nationalism. So in similar vein that we see in recent scholarship on the political dynamics of resource nationalism, I will address two analytical issues in this paper. One, a critique of existing scholarship to emphasize the role of state-society relations, political processes in a post-colonial peripheral political context. And second, a critique of social movements challenging new liberal resource policy in the global periphery. So those are my main goals in this paper. So in the Bangladeshi context, new liberal resource or energy policy looks like this. The state and foreign corporate capital favor such arrangement where state agencies, state companies, public sector companies will play as little role as possible. Such policy opposes, as you know, the state's involvement as such foreign corporate capital gradually becomes dominant actor in Bangladesh's smaller scale, I would say, not very much, and not as big as Southern African region, resource and energy sector. State-owned companies are gradually marginalized. They become, increasingly, they have become junior partners of international oil and gas companies, and foreign corporate capital and their local allies within political and bureaucratic elites shape such policy agenda. I would also highlight that the genesis of such new liberal resource and energy policy, we can trace the roots of such policy framework in the Bangladeshi context, originated from in international financial institutions, various structural adjustment programs implemented in 1980s, especially World Bank's petroleum exploration, export promotion project implemented in 1980s. I'll come back to this point in a few seconds. So this is the overall policy framework that Bangladesh has been following since 1980s, but civil society actors take a different view to displace the consensus of the state and foreign corporate capital. Their political agenda shaped by resource nationalist rhetoric. So in this paper, resource nationalism is coming from the oppositional political struggles, civil society actors who are contesting government's resource energy policy, government's, the state and the foreign corporate capital, they are very much aligned with the existing neoliberal frameworks. Civil society actors, their political struggles made energy resource development as the most contested public policy agenda in Bangladesh since at least 2000, I would say. During 1998 and 2015, those movements forced the Bangladeshi government to make some U-turns in various cases. I will discuss 3 of those in this paper. So the social movement I'm talking about in this paper is organized by a civil society organization named National Committee to Protect Oil, Gas, Mineral Resources, Power and Force, NCBD. It consists of left political parties, political and cultural activists, mostly centered around public universities in the capital city, energy experts, working in various universities, and some academics. It was formed in 1998. Its key movement agenda emphasizes its nature as what can be characterized as resource radicals. So its three main demands are like this. It calls for ensuring people's ownership over strategic natural resources. So it doesn't call state ownership because it has it problematizes the notion of state ownership in the context of global peripheral political process. It also calls for increasing capability of national institutions, especially oil and gas companies established in early 1970s. And it also demands prohibiting any direct ownership of foreign capital over resource extraction projects in Bangladesh. So these are three key demands that we can see how these demands actually responds to the issues, the features of resource nationalism. So I'll just very briefly talk about the emergence of NCBD's popular movements in resource energy sector in Bangladesh. New liberal transformation of Bangladesh's energy sector under World Bank funded petroleum exploration promotion project began in 1990s during the military rule. As you know, World Bank and other, particularly the World Bank, along with other development partners in the global South, they aggressively promote many of their structural adjustment measures, often in authoritarian, repressive, during the time of authoritarian and repressive regime. Bangladesh is no exception to that. So this new liberal transformation began in the 1980s during the military rule. The main goal of the project was to attract international oil companies in Bangladesh's energy sector. Subsequent so-called democratic regime since 1991 accelerated the pace without adequate transparency, accountability, and consultation. We have heard about consultation in some other context in our previous panel. This new policy regime strengthened power and authority of foreign corporate capital in Bangladesh's energy sector, displacing national oil and gas company as the key actor. And this the discontent over government's new liberal energy resource policy did not emerge in a vacuum. There was a vivid context that happened in 1971. So as I mentioned earlier, in 1993, the then government signed a number of contracts with many American IOCs. And they started exploration here and there in different parts in gas-rich regions. In 1997, there was an explosion in one of those gas fields, which was under construction at that time. So a blowout happened in a gas field called Magurchhara in northeast region in Bangladesh in 1997. The field was operated by an American oil company, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, you know the name. The company had an agreement with the Bangladeshi government to develop several gas fields in different regions. The agreement was based on, I would emphasize this point, the agreement was based on a model production sharing contract prepared by experts employed by the World Bank under its petroleum export promotion project. The model contract signed by the government did not include any clause so that the company could be held accountable for any damage of resources and the environment during their operation. Energy companies call these model contract as international best practice, and the World Bank and other development partners support such model of PSC as a market-friendly policy instrument. Fine, who pays the price? Bangladesh could not claim any compensation for the loss of resources and damages to the environment, which was estimated about $685 million. This event led to the formation of NCBD, and we observed the emergence of a popular social movement. So in this paper, I have analyzed 3 cases of NCBD's popular mobilization in the past several years since their beginning in 1998. These 3 cases are mobilization against an American oil company's project to export natural gas to India. So the company got an agreement, signed an agreement with the Bangladeshi government. They were about to develop the gas field, but they were not very much enthusiastic about moving forward with the project unless the government changed the agreement to allow it to export gas to India. The whole American administration put enormous pressure on the Bangladeshi government to allow Occident, at the time it was UNOCAL, to allow its gas development and export project. Even the then American president visited Bangladesh at the time and raised this issue with his meeting with the Bangladeshi Prime Minister, and the Bangladeshi Prime Minister mentioned that she would ensure gas supply for the Bangladeshi people for the next 50 years, and if any gas remains after making very thorough calculations, she would consider that. Some political leaders claim that for that reason, her government failed in the following election. So I'm not going into that. So the NCBD and other civil society actors led by them mobilized a huge public campaign throughout the country to oppose a gas export plan. The second case is a mobilization against Australian British mining companies, export-oriented open pit coal mine in the northwestern region in Bangladesh. And the third one is mobilization against an American IOC's offshore oil and gas development project. In this case, the government signed an agreement with the company, ConocoPhillips. The company started its preliminary works, did some studies in offshore areas, and eventually, after a few years, it asked the government to revise the contract to increase the gas price, unit price, and also to allow it to export gas to preferably to India or in other countries. And again, informed by resource nationalist rhetoric, NCBD and their allies, they mobilized a very powerful popular campaign persuading the government not to revise the contract and allow the company to export gas to India. So I relied on interviews with NCBD leaders and activists, their movement documents, policy documents of the Bangladeshi government and the World Bank to make sense of sort of sociological sense of or political economy sense of their activism and vis-a-vis these 3 cases. I'd also add that in the about the second, a few points about the second case where NCBD mobilized both grassroots communities in the mining region in northwest region in Bangladesh, and also nationally in the capital city, protesting the agreement that the Bangladeshi government signed with the Australian British mining company. A new mining company actually got a huge contract because of the lobby from the Australian and British government agencies. They signed a contract with huge benefits that they would get, and some government insiders provided some information to the activists, claiming that Bangladesh government will really not benefit from this multi-billion-dollar mining project, and eventually it will end up in huge environmental disaster and at the expense of grassroots communities, and the mining company will get the major share of the pie. So these are some of the images that I'm showing. The first one is not of good quality. It happened sometime, some years ago, in 2002, a long march by NCBD activists from Dhaka, the capital city, to the gas field area in Northeast region. The second one is NCBD's rally against open pit coal mine in Northeast region in a place called Fulbari, where you can see from this image, local people, including women, they participated and eventually persuaded the government to shelve the project for the time being. And it happened in 2006. The mining companies is still there. They are hoping that at some point down the road, they would be able to persuade the government, bureaucrats and political elites to get their mining proposal approved. The third one is an image showing a rally NCBD called a nationwide strike. You can imagine in a country where a civil society organization called nationwide strike several times, not just once, several times, to draw attention to these serious issues in Bangladesh's resource and energy sector. NCBD's rally near Petrobangla headquarters, Bangladesh's national oil and gas company, and NCBD's national convention outlining their movement agenda with three key demands that I mentioned earlier. So it's a poster from NCBD's campaign urging people to protect public resources from corrupt politicians and bureaucrats who work as brokers of foreign energy companies. So in all these three cases, the movement with a large-scale public participation, they succeeded in persuading the government to make U-turns. In the case of the gas export plan, government did not revise the agreement with the American company. In the second case, the coal mine, government made a decision not to go ahead with any open pit coal mining, considering that it will create livelihood challenges for land-dependent peasant and indigenous communities in that area. And in the third case, government did not revise the contract with ConocoPhillips to increase the gas price and to allow it to export gas to neighboring countries, preferably to India. And in the first case, gas export case, the company eventually agreed to develop the gas field, and that gas field is now, they supply the major share of natural gas to the Bangladesh's national oil company, and they provide it to various power plants and for other use. But the coal mine is still in limbo. Government made a decision that it would not continue with open pit coal mining, but company is still there maintaining an office in Dhaka with an expectation that one day they will be able to go ahead with that. And in the third case, ConocoPhillips eventually abandoned their project and they left Bangladesh. So based on my understanding of my interviews with NCVD activists and leaders, and also analysis of their movement documents, I find these 4 issues that that inform their resource nationalist social movement rhetoric. For NCVD, existing production sharing contract-based resource policy is problematic for several reasons. These 4 reasons are very prominent, not only in their literature, but also in discussions with any activist or leaders. They argue that such a model fails to protect national interest. By national interest, they emphasize that more and more they see that foreign companies, they are enjoying the greater share of the resource energy development business. So they consider that as a threat to national interest. It marginalizes national institutions. If we compare 2 time points in 1980s or even 1990s, and now we see the share of national oil and gas company in energy resource development has decreased significantly. Now the major dominant players are international oil companies. They argue that such arrangement endangers national energy security. They argue that export-based model will encourage international oil companies to extract resources as quickly as possible, given the market signals in terms of pricing. So they would benefit from quick extraction of resources, and eventually in future, Bangladesh will face enormous energy security challenges. So I'll just very briefly highlight why they talk about this issue. They extend the issue of protecting national interest to endangers national energy security, as well as they also enlarge that argument, saying that it threatens national political sovereignty as the state gradually loses control over what they call not just energy security, but also energy sovereignty. I'll just highlight very briefly one case, one issue to emphasize why they are arguing that that government, Bangladesh is facing an energy security issue as well as energy sovereignty issue. Recall the first case I mentioned about gas export to India by Unocal, and American president put pressure on the Bangladesh's prime minister to accept the company's proposal. At the time, the company spread a propaganda saying that Bangladesh was floating on natural gas. So even if you export for the next 50 years, there was huge natural gas reserve in several areas in Bangladesh. After 10, 20 years, now it's the case that the remaining gas reserve will last for only 8 to 10 years. And Bangladesh has already started importing LNG from Qatar and other places, particularly from the spot market in Singapore. So from this kind of corporate propaganda and the political pressure on the Bangladeshi government, these civil society activists, they came to the point that that if we allow these production sharing contract-based export-oriented resource development project, eventually Bangladesh's national energy security and energy sovereignty would be threatened. I'll just add, conclude with this point. You see here in the slide two images. On the left side, you see Petrobangla, Bangladesh's national petroleum company. On the right side, you see Petronas, Malaysia's national petroleum company. Both companies were established at the same time In the Bangladeshi case, Petrobangla was established in 1972. Petronas was established in 1974. Today, Petronas is a global energy company with projects in more than 100 countries, including Canada. They have a large presence in Alberta's oil sand sector. On the other hand, Bangladesh's Petrobangla remained a company, national oil and gas company, with limited technical and financial capacity. For NCBD, companies, national oil companies like Petronas is a model where state support over the years, in the past 40, 50 years, made it a global energy company, whereas Bangladesh remained dependent on IOCs, and it crippled national oil and gas company. So they frequently use this case to emphasize their social movement discourses and mobilization rhetoric. I'll just take 30 seconds to conclude my my presentation. I will emphasize that NCBD's resource nationalist critique draws our attention to complex political dynamics in a political context of a peripheral country deeply embedded in the global capitalist system. State-society relations need to be considered to make sense of these resource nationalist social movement. I'll also argue that some critical issues remain unresolved in a political context that is characterized by corruption, cronyism, lack of the rule of law, and criminalized politics and economy. Even if we ensure basic principles and premises of resource nationalism, in such political context, I would argue that resource nationalism-based resource development policy regime will look like a new liberal business as usual. And here lies the challenges of oppositional social movements aiming for major benefits for citizens in resource-rich countries in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. There's a lesson to what we can learn from elsewhere is a lot in terms of highlighting the national dimensions of social movements and not the local. And perhaps I'll have a little bit more to say about that. Thank you so much for that. Really comprehensive and thorough case illustration of what national social movements can do. Thanks so much. Not to conclude, but rather to sustain, as it were, our engagement with other places other than Southern Africa and other parts of Africa. We have a presentation that deals with Indonesia. And I don't, do I have bios on? I should. I don't seem to see it here. Let's see. Beg your pardon. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. We have Raras Kai Fitri. He's a lecturer in the Department of International Relations, the Faculty of Social and Political Science, FISPOL, at Gajah Mada University. Among her research interests are the political economy of natural resource governance, energy, and environmental politics, the international political economy of investment. She obtained a bachelor's degree in international relations from UGM and a master's degree in political economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Nanyang Indra Kuryawan is a lecturer in the Department of Politics and Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at FISPOL and the Universitas Gadjah Mada. His research interests include civil societies, environmental politics, and natural resource politics. He obtained his bachelor's degree from the Department of Politics and Government, a master's degree in political science and management, and the study of management at Agder University College, Norway, and a doctoral degree from the Asia Institute Faculty of Arts in the University of Melbourne, Australia. So thank you, and please begin.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our research. So my name is Nanang Indra Kurniawan. Together with my colleagues Raras Cahya Fitri, we would like to present our paper, Local Politics in Resource Nationalism Narratives within Indonesian Tin Sector. In this presentation, we will show how the Indonesian government recent ambition to decentralize its power over natural resources, particularly tin, in the name of national development and industrialization, and how has this led to new political tensions at the local level, particularly in tin producing areas, which is dominated by artisanal small-scale mining. To give you a context on why it is relevant to discuss about tin sector and resource nationalism in Indonesia, I will start with the importance of tin materially and the position of Indonesia in the global tin production. So tin is actually used for many purposes like solders, chemicals, tin plate, batteries, tin copper, and so on and so on. And now within this growing trend of digitalization and green technology, the demand of tin is expected to increase in the coming years. So as you can see here that in 2022, International Tin Association, for instance, show that 50% of this total tin production is used for solders for connecting these components in electronics devices. Next. Yeah, and tin actually is really important for Indonesia. It contributes to Indonesian economy. And Indonesia itself has been contributing quite significant in global tin productions. Indonesia have like around 17% of total tin reserve in the world after China. And in 2023, Indonesia produced refined tin around 90%, 19%, after China with 47%. So this just to show on how important of Indonesia, how important Indonesia is in this global tin production. Next. Well, extractive industry in Indonesia, including tin, is actually very important to be explored, particularly because of its important in not only on economic but also in politics, but in economic development and in politics. This is, for example, on how in Indonesian history Indonesia has been rely on economic sources for development through export of raw commodities, including tin, gold, copper, and recently nickel for battery production. And what is also important is that this extractive sector is also one of the most source of this rent-seeking process for these powerful elites in Indonesia, both in national or in a local level. Next. To give you kind of overview about tin production in Indonesia, 90% of tin production in Indonesia is actually sourced from a province in Bangka Belitung Island. This is a small provinces near Sumatra and near Borneo, but this two islands has produced around 90% of tin production in Indonesia. Next. In this Bangka and Belitung Island, tin extraction has been carried out through two methods. First is industrial process, and second one is produced through artisanal mining process. And as we will show later, that the tension between this industrial scale and artisanal mining, tin mining in Bangka and Belitung has created a kind of tension, political tension between not only between the state and the local communities, but also between this local government as well as the national government. Next. So to start with, I think it's important to understand about the a growing resource nationalism tendency in Indonesia in recent years. But basically, resource nationalism itself is shown in the spirit of resource national is actually shown in this Constitution of Republic of Indonesia, particularly in Article 33, which says that the land, the waters, and the natural riches contained therein shall be controlled by the state and exploited to the greatest benefit of the people. This article actually created a kind of justification for the state, for the government to justify its control over natural resources. In tin sectors, this sector has been actually tin actually has been extracted since the Dutch colonial government during the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries, and it was operated through a kind of monopolistic and centralistic model. And after Indonesian independence in 1945, the Indonesian government tried to follow and to continue what the model that has been carried out by the Dutch colonial government. So, for example, in 1953, the Indonesian government nationalized Dutch-owned companies into state-controlled companies called PN Tambang Timah, which later on called PT Timah. And during this period after 1943 until 1999, tin has been regarded as by the state as a national strategic commodity, which means that its extraction and the trade were controlled by the state. The thing is that within this process, the benefits of tin extraction mostly flew to the elites in the center, in the national government, and give less economic gains for the local peoples, because the local peoples they were not allowed to mine the tin. All of the process should be in the hand of the national government and in the hand of the state. And those who involved in this artisanal illegal mining and trading will be punished by the state apparatus. But this process has been changing in 1999 following the Asian financial crisis, where the natural resource sector in Indonesia has been liberalized. In 1999, for example, the decree of Minister of Trade of Industry said that tin was no longer the state strategic commodity. That means that the state, the national government, would no longer take control over the extraction as well as the trade of tin. So everyone now it's getting liberalized. It's now more open. And in 1999, the local government law was passed, and under this law, local governments were allowed to issue tin mining license. Not like before, it was issued by the national government. Now the local government has the opportunity to issue the license. This has led to the emergence of private actors and the growing practices of people artisanal mining and tin ore export. But then the problem is that this liberalization has created a kind of mushrooming of this artisanal mining. For example, in 2023, the Indonesian government mentioned that more than half of this tin ore production is actually produced by the artisanal mining. This, to some extent, it also threatened the national government control over these resources. So, in addition to that, there is also increasing illegal mining activities within this state-owned companies' concession area. So the license that were issued by the local governments particularly was issued in the area which not much tin research. So these artisanal tin miners, they do this mining processes within this area of PT Timah concession area. So this has been created a tension between these state-owned companies with the local communities. Recently, there is kind of commodity booms, particularly with this global demand of raw materials during the 2000s, including tin. which made the national government see that the Indonesian government should get the kind of added value from this process. So the Indonesian government banned the raw mineral export through 2009 mineral and coal mining law. And the idea is that Indonesia and the government should get more benefit from these natural resources, not only exporting raw minerals. This has been creating a kind of new developmentalism as well as resource nationalism nexus, because the government used the rhetorics that through this export ban that we will have a more benefit from our national resources. To follow this policy, the Indonesian government carried out what we call as downstream policies and increasing national government control in tin mining and trading. And recently, Indonesian government has also accelerated the investment and economic development and strengthening of central government role in the mining sector through several new laws, like in 2014 laws, local government laws, which took over the authority from the district government to issue license. Now they no longer can issue the license. Now this authority has been taken over by the national government through the provincial government. As well, in 2020 mineral law, where the state tried to underline the importance of this downstreaming policies and banning of export raw materials. And in 2020, with the job creation law, where the Indonesian government tried to accelerate the process and to cut off some processes which seem slowing down the investment process. And last one is the ministry regulation on tin export, which requires tin export and tin trading through this commodity exchange. Next. What I want to say is that to some extent also this nationalistic approach has been used also by the politicians in the national government to create a kind of populist narratives that this approach has been used by the government to give the best benefit to the Indonesian people. So I will pass the next presentation to Raras.
Thank you. So I will be building up from the previous established model of Indonesian resource nationalism. And we've seen how then this kind of nationalism has been changed, has been perceived differently from time to time. So I would like to highlight that there are several issues in resource nationalism in terms of the practice that we have seen from our field work. So in addition, additional information, we did the field work during the 2022 until 2024. So we've seen several new issues. I would say there are still this idea that tin extraction, the natural resource extractions, is kind of the opportunity for economic growth. However, as previously mentioned, it is also encouraged by other externalities, which is the increasing demand of renewable energy technology and also, in particular, electricity vehicle. We also seen that from 2009, when the government of Indonesia introduced the mineral and mining policy, mineral and coal mining policy, which was aimed to change Indonesia's aspirations from raw material exporter into a more refined products of minerals. And it was the objective was to climb up the global supply chain. However, throughout our field work, we also see that, especially in tin extraction, it's not always about this elitist or maybe top-down aspirations, but also everyday survival, especially of the artisanal miners, small miners, who are relying their daily life, relying their livelihood from tin extractions. As an additional information, tin mining, tin extraction is kind of distinct in terms that it is relatively easy for small miners or individual to mine the tin. So from the previous pictures you might have seen as well, it's not necessarily always the big industries, but also the small miners, which mean that the interest is not only on the global side, but also on the daily survival. As also mentioned, the extraction in Indonesia, especially in the natural resource, it's always used to to gain votes in domestic politics, especially because it's established in the constitution. However, we also a bit concerned because we've seen, for example, there are to a certain extent regulations that is then loosened to allow, especially those, especially in this case in tin industry, state-owned enterprises to extract more tin to meet the global demands, but also for the domestic market. We also seen that this tin extraction in Indonesia, it's usually rigid. There are rules, there are regulations, there are continuing ministerial regulation, technical regulations that are issued by the government. So these kind of instruments are used as this nationalism instruments. On your left side, for example, in this slide, it is a log sheet that we obtained from our fieldwork provided by a company doing refining, tin refining. And as you can see, there are numbers. Maybe it's not too clear, but in the numbers, there are details of the quantity of the raw materials, the quantity of additional materials, and the amount of tin that they are produced, and they have to report that to the supervisor, to the government in particular. However, these rules and sanctions often more mechanism that usually people do, these miners do as a checklist, and they usually adhere more on the voluntary regulations that are beyond checklist, beyond the quantity, but also the environmental sustainability issue, etc. We from the previous explanations, we also understand that rent seeking is by default in this tin extraction. It's been part of the revenue for the government, where we also see that there are growing social and environmental values that are being considered, being discussed within the narratives among the people. Then also building from the previous explanations, what makes tin unique in this case, especially during the decentralized Indonesia and the recent development of the tin extraction, it's this kind of opening up of this tin sector has led to the illegal practices. Where then, given this idea, there are these different views of how then the mechanism and also arrangement of the decentralizations should be done in particularly in the tin producing areas. It is divided between whether the resource nationalism is not only talking about the profit, but also in this tin issue, whether it has to support the return of the centralistic government, because decentralization lead to illegal practices, right? So to a certain people, to a certain element of the society, thinking that, well, it's better than the central government taking over as in the past. Also due to the decentralizations and also understanding of how this tin sector should be governed, this issue is then on the main actors in the in the supporting the return of the centralized government, which is the state-owned enterprises. Then with this complex overview, the complex issue in the tin extractions, the resource nationalism in Indonesia in the tin sector is not only then talking about the economic return, etc., but also how it is improved the current system, or maybe kind of correct the current system, whether it will be returned to the past, as mentioned, more on the populist side, more on the state developmentalism side, but also whether it should be, not whether it should be, but also to discuss whether the transparency issues should be increased, especially against corrupt practices, which is quite well known in state-owned enterprises in Indonesia. However, there are also other camps thinking that the decentralized governance means that there are more actors in the sector that will contribute to the implementations of the previous attempt to improve the economic development. This has create this kind of tension between at the elite level between the central government and the provincial government about the level of the authority, which scope that should be performed by the national government, which one should be performed with the provincial governments, and maybe kind of good and still bad things. But the provincial government currently is allowed to perform initiatives to curb illegal mining, for example, by establishing a local task force to curb the illegal mining. However, it is also a controversy because the provincial government are doing this with collaborations with a local conglomerate, who is dominating the tin industry as well. So how then we try to understand all the complexity. We try to understand. We also try to connect how these different views of resource nationalism also fit into the current development of Indonesia. And the first thing that came up to our thinking is that, well, this is kind of this resource nationalism, the way that it is produced, the narrative is produced, the way that is maintained, can be in a good way, can be the tools of the government to repurpose the transnational supply chain regulations for industrial development. So we understand that there are supply chain regulations that I've mentioned earlier that several companies, several actors prefer to adhere because they cover more on the social issue, on the environmental issue. And this kind of supply chain regulations has been the justifications for the recentralization for the industrial government. So the government taking lead on this issue, the state-owned enterprises taking lead on the issue because they have more on the arrangement, they have more on the capital, etc. On the other side, the companies, the private actors, both those small miners, they usually have this link with a bigger network, and they are when they have this network with the end user, which means the users of the product like Apple maybe, or maybe Samsung, they have these collaborations to adhere to the certain environmental and human rights standards that these big companies ask for the supplier of the materials, so that because they have the obligations to obey the international regulations as well. And this is the the thing that we proposed earlier in this presentation is actually on the discourses that is developed in the tin industry, tin extraction industry. It's from our field work, we understand that people do not only talk about this is nationalist movement or etc., but they refer to certain thing which is Indonesian flag. Merah putih, merah means red and putih means white, which is the colors of Indonesian flag. And they always say when we discuss with the people, they always say we are merah putih, we are the red and black, we are the representative of Indonesian. They do not necessarily talk about the concept of the nationalism itself, but they anchor it into a certain symbol. This is interesting for us because they do not necessarily only talk, well, this is for Indonesia, this is for the big or maybe the national interest to support economic growth, but they divide it into the discussions are divided into as I mentioned earlier, whether the government should taking side with the centralistic one, or whether some other people will prefer to avoid being part of the any kind of framework or any kind of arrangement, any kind of initiatives initiated by state-owned enterprises, because they do not see state-owned enterprises, for example, as a good example of nationalism, as a good example of Indonesian merah putih symbol, because they have the corruption cases, because they do not adhere, for example, to certain international standards, etc. And this issue has been increasing as well. Sorry. Okay, I have one more. I will be very quick, but yeah, this issue has been increasing as well due to the renewable energy technology support, which create the challenges of the productions. The last thing that I would like to emphasize is with this current resource nationalism, the difference with what we see from the types of resource nationalism that have been taking place in Indonesia is that there are this has been the mechanism to contain some new actors. For example, all people can mine, as I mentioned. This is a kind of easier to mine things than other. However, it is quite difficult for those small miners or maybe those individuals to do the smelting and refining. But then the license for smelting and refining facilities usually more thorough investigated. So it's more difficult to get this license. The next thing, containing is by the trading mechanism. So the refined tin in Indonesia is currently not freely traded, because all trades should be performed in the domestic commodity exchange. And there are also certifications for individuals to assess the quantity and the quality of the train that can be traded. That ends my presentation, our presentations. But to just to follow up, we have a documentary video that you may want to look into. It's not necessarily talking about the resource nationalism, but it talks more about the issues on the tin extractions. So thank you.
Oh, the mic dead. Oh. Okay. I had a question for Omar. I'll keep it quick. I imagine you're familiar with some of the work of Paul Gilbert, who also writes on resource nationalism in Bangladesh. Okay. The only reason I asked this is because I attended a conference with him once, and he looked at resource nationalism in relation to coal mining in Bangladesh. And he drew an interesting sort of analysis around the notion that related to coal mining, at least, Bangladeshi social movements were able to draw concessions from the coal miners through arbitrary processes, right, in the courts, right? And so and not to draw this kind of very maybe unwarranted or unfair comparison, but did you find in your own research that in some instances where social protest has failed in drawing concessions from multinationals, arbitration and legal proceedings have drawn some successes, let's say, I say successes in quotations?
Yeah, I'm familiar with his work, but I don't know what he meant by the case that social movements gained concession from mining companies in the case of coal mining in Bangladesh, because there is only one case where the one that I talked about, where massive grassroots movement forced the Bangladeshi government to suspend preliminary mining activities that they are doing there, and eventually an alliance of national and transnational activism forced the government and the mining company to suspend the project for the time being. So it was not a concession provided by the mining company through arbitration or any other process. It just they couldn't gain any sort of social license to operate in the area. But in other cases, like I would suggest that not in the case of mining, but in other cases, similar social movements failed to persuade the project proponents and the government agencies to pay serious attention to their demands. For example, coal-based power plants by an Indian company, a joint venture of India and Bangladeshi company near the Sundarbans, an ecologically sensitive area and UNESCO heritage site. The movement for the past 12 years couldn't persuade neither the Indian actors nor the Bangladeshi government to pay attention to that. They were not anti-coal movement per se. They were advocating for shifting the location of the power plant from the current site to another site, so that could save Sundarbans, the forest, the mangrove forest from pollution. So yeah, there are several cases even in Bangladesh where social movements couldn't achieve any their desired goals, but some of the cases, at least the 3 cases, and there are 1 or 2 other cases where social movements were successful. But again, I would not give the full credits to the social movements for all their successes. There were many other factors, some political issues involved in the process of this whole mobilization agenda.
Thanks to everybody on the panel. I thought the quite rich and textured papers, very interesting empirical evidence and some arguments I think can maybe develop further out of them. My question is mainly addressed to the last paper in Indonesia, which I thought was really interesting, and the layers of complexity, the contradictory nature of resource nationalism, which you outlined, different levels of government, are all really fascinating. I guess my first question would be is kind of complexity and the kind of the evolution of resource nationalist approaches or perspectives on tin. How do they fit with the case that's known better, maybe internationally, around resource nationalism and new interventions from Indonesia, and that's around the nickel ban, the export of raw ore or semi-processed ore. Is it the same kind of politics and same kind of perspective, or does tin as a commodity have a different dynamic? in Indonesia and a different place, a different economic placement. This was really fascinating case study, and I'm just wondering how it's aligned with or is in conversation with the mineral politics around nickel in Indonesia.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think the case of nickel and tin is in the similar framework of this resource nationalism in Indonesia. I think the Indonesian government see that these two commodities, nickel and tin, Indonesia is in the key player, global players, so that they think that the Indonesian government think that this can be used as leverage to use these two commodities, make by using the recent global demand of tin and nickel to bring further industrialization in Indonesia, as well as to develop this Indonesian economy. However, as we have already mentioned earlier, this also interconnected with the elites, political elites interests, who are also directly or indirectly involved in this two commodities. Some of them are involved as the owner of this the smelters, the processing station, and things like that. So yes, these two commodities are interconnected and work in the same framework of this current resource nationalism.
I have a following question for the Indonesia case. Could you please elaborate on the foreign investor interference with the local or domestic control or mining ownership? I have in mind the case of the Newmont or Nusa Tenggara case back in 2014. I would definitely love to hear more about that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take this one directly. Tin is a bit different in terms of the investors, because the main and the key actors is state-owned enterprises. As we mentioned earlier, PT Timah. It was, well, for now, foreign player is not as many as in other commodities, such as in nickel or in gold, as you mentioned, such as Newmont or Freeport. No, it's more on the state-owned enterprises and local players. These state-owned enterprises, well, as previously also mentioned, has been, well, kind of the legacy of the Dutch colonial. There was collaborations with foreign firms. However, it now has ended, and it's more on the state-owned enterprises, which is centralized with the local players. And how then the foreign, well, it's not necessarily that they are only local players. They are only raising fund or they don't know. They have the international network as well. They mine, they produce things, whether this is legal or illegal, usually based on the demand. And from our field work in Bangka Belitung, we understand that these people have these certain connections with foreign capital as well. But it's not that kind of how to put it, that kind of easily seen. Why? Because there is this trading arrangement in the tin sector, which is very different to also mention the previous question, which is slightly different with the nickel and other commodities. The tin, refined tin from Indonesian mining areas should be traded into the commodity exchange, the local commodity exchange. And this local commodity exchange has this kind of membership, has this kind of who are the traders and buyers, etc., which kind of obscure the capital flow. There are capital flow for the local players, as we understood from the fieldwork, however, is not that easily as seen as in other commodity market. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Veras. I have a very, very brief question for both of you, if I can. I'll try to keep it really brief. One is about the regionalism and the impact of regionalism upon affecting the nationalist discourse around resource nationalism. And the second is for both of you, as well as to Omar, which is about timing. Omar mentioned, for example, at the end of his presentation about the difference between Malaysia and Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is a fairly recent state, 1971, I think, if my historical memory reminds me. Malaysia, I think, is the 1950s. And so there's a difference in terms of the consolidation of resource nationalism. So it's a comment as much as a question, just in terms of that trajectory. So maybe comment on that. But for you, it has to do with the regionalism and the kind of awareness of regional resources as opposed to national resources, and whether there's a tension there in the context of Indonesia. Okay, thank you.
In our research, we do not explore much about this, the idea of this regionalism. However, in nickel and in tin sectors, it is not like the palm oil sector, which create a kind of regionalism for palm oil, like this Malaysia as well as Thailand as well as Indonesia in seeing this palm oil sector as the main sectors which they will defend in the idea of regionalism. But in tin sector, we do not have any indications with that. Probably Raras can add something about that.
Not in particular, because we didn't go into the regional perspective in this regard. That's basically what we have so far.
Yeah, you're right. There are certainly differences between these two political economic context in terms of economic base, poor economic base that Bangladesh started with in 1971 and 1972, and greater resource base for the Malaysian company. This civil society organization, NCBD, they use this comparison just to energize their activists and present their case to the Bangladeshi policymakers that, look, there is not much difference, although they are in a better position, but with sound nationalistic policy and drive, we can really look at them as a role model, and we can strengthen our national company, and we can really undertake all these activities on our own. So that's the comparison, the role model there.
Well, it remains to me, we're a little bit over time, but it remains to me to thank the three presentations today, and I want to give them a very rousing concluding round of applause in Cesar, Madeleine, Omar, Raras, and Nana. Thank you so much.
It was a really great session. We've had a lot of them. That was another one. We're moving to wind up before lunch, and just a few words of comment from me before I'll invite Pablo to come back and offer a few reflections. As everybody who's been participating knows, Pablo has been both here but also online, and with a very sharp and clear perspective and interesting inputs over the course of the last 3 days. So I'll be asking him to come back in a moment. I just want to speak briefly to what I'd mentioned at the outset of our meeting were the goals of us getting together in this conversation, and I hope we've met some of them, and I hope It's been worth the effort for many of you who've come a long way and who have stayed up late and gotten up at odd times in order to participate online as well. I hope it's been worth the effort, that we've all learned something from each other, and that we have the basis for carrying forwards a different kind of conversation, which has been inflected by what we've heard over the last 2.5 days. At the outset, as you know, I'd laid as my expectations, the expectations of the Resource Nationalism Southern African Partnership, what some of the goals were. And one of them was to actually foster an engaged, evidence-based conversation on recent evidence and some historical legacy around resource nationalism and the iterations it takes in various places, what its implications are, and I suppose from our own perspective in the partnership, how we can participate in, help convene, and strengthen the direction in a progressive, redistributive sense of what resource nationalism might come to mean in different ways, in different places, and in different kinds of regulatory activities. So it's fostering a conversation across regional and historical experiences through looking at innovations and their successes and pitfalls, and particularly from our perspective, the trajectory of what policy making looks like in this current period. And for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, this is the period of the post-commodity supercycle boom of the early 2000s. And also wanted, as part of our goals, quite selfishly in our partnership, was to inform our own work as we move forward to start to conclude the work of the partnership on resource nationalism in the current period through working papers and publications. And I think in that sense, and I'm sure I speak for the research team and my partnership, that this conversations has really done that. I think we've learned a lot, some really interesting critical perspectives which we hadn't raised in our partnership, and I think which can be very useful now as we move to conclude, write up the work. You've heard bits and pieces of the raw data, and there's a lot more, and I think these conversations will really help us to have one more think about how we're going to use this material and the best way that we can take it forward. One of the things that I take from this, particularly as we enter into a new range of work with many of our partnership members around critical minerals, African critical minerals and the global green transition, is how to be aware of, and it's been raised many times in different ways and phraseologies, how to be aware of the entrapments of continuities of neoliberalized, regularized approaches to market-centric approaches, market-friendly approaches to resource nationalism or nationalism around things that we thought were at the centerpiece of policymaking, things like productive linkages and tax reform, how we need to be aware of the pitfalls of, as some have said, the slippery slope of sliding into complacency, and what the criteria might be to avoid those kinds of entrapments as the discussions and debates around some form of resource nationalism continues, as they certainly will in the era of critical minerals, growing demand for Southern African minerals, and growing temptations to take advantage of the economic and political opportunities associated with them. So I think I've learned a lot from our conversations, and I think members of our partnership have too, as we take that forward. Quite selfishly, we will certainly look to mobilize some of the insight we've had from this meeting. I think the discussion has really exceeded our expectations when we designed the agenda to both give space to different geopolitical areas and national and subnational forms of engagement around minerals management. I think the texture and the quality and the different perspectives on some of the panels have structuralist and post-structuralist have been really fascinating, really interesting, and have raised as many questions as we'd sought to answer, and if not more. Look beyond nation states to the repositioning of thinking around resource nationalism and extractivism itself. I think the discussion around environmental and local social impacts and responses to resource national strategies by states been interesting, engaging. The calculation, the question of calculating benefits and costs, not just in dollar terms, in terms of industrial output terms, but also in terms of natural capital, human capital, social benefits. That's also raised some issues that need to be addressed and engaged with. Obviously, issues of ecological sustainability, always the case when we're dealing with mining. But another thing that has come in again today in this session, which I think would really bear thinking about, is considering as well the issue of downstream processing of minerals before industrialization and the ways in which registration, formalization, and mobilization of the resources that come from the processing end of minerals locally might be incorporated more directly and meaningfully into understanding of not just beneficiation, but as a resource nationalist component of policy making. It's something that really came through in a few different panels, which doesn't emerge so strongly in our own work in Southern Africa, maybe because of the status of beneficiation in many of our instances, maybe not. But it's something that really got me thinking in that direction. Paper on Uganda, this paper on Indonesia, and others. It's really fascinating and challenging, provocative in that sense. So I want to thank our contributors for those insights too. And of course, issues of social movements, which we've seen at the level of Indigenous and First Nations, responses to and challenges around minerals, but also local level communities in South Asia and Latin America, in Africa as well. Questions not just of displacement, but of new locally driven discourses of benefits and of gains and participation and inclusion. Very interesting and again, provocative. And I think it's food for thought for our work as we take it forward. And again, the revisiting of established visions and suggestions and imaginaries of what resource nationalist perspectives might look like and policies might look like in the Global South. African mining vision obviously comes to mind in that regard, but also neo-extractivist frontiers in Latin America, cosmologies of post-extractivism in Latin America, lithium frontiers and what that means, and what it means to the people who are actually intended beneficiaries of any kind of formalistic resource national strategy. I think all of those things, including with a revisiting of historical perspectives, a retake on resource nationalism in its earlier wave in the 1960s. I think all of those have got me thinking, and I think have got a certain buzz going amongst our partnership, and I think in the room as well, that's come through in the kinds of questions we've had, the reiteration of perspectives or echoes coming forward in different panels of these kinds of rethinking of older models or imaginaries and how we might embellish them, strengthen them, and catalyze them with some new energy in our work. So I want to thank everyone for online and here, our panelists and those who've contributed with questions and insights as part of the conversation, for creating a different texture and a stronger terrain, a movable terrain, evolving one, around how we can think in a more open, critical, empirically driven way, learning in a similar moments, in the kinds of moments from each other in very different kinds of places. Lots of similar vocabulary, but different perspectives and experiences, very critical perspectives, questioning the value and the benefits and the motivations of, what we've collectively in a broad way have called resource nationalism. I think it's been a really lively, engaging, moving conversation, one in which people have been taking other perspectives seriously and learning and engaging with other spaces which we haven't had so much research engagement with in the past. I would really like to see us take this forward. As I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting on the first day, we, in the Southern African Partnership, we've been approached regarding putting together a publication of our work. We made a decision, a strategic decision last year to expand the scope of that conversation and the work. That's where this conference came from, so that we could engage, see what's out there, what interest there was. And as we move forward, I would very much like to follow up on that decision of our partnership and begin to invite contributions based upon the kinds of material that we've all heard and participated in the last few days. So that's my plan going forward. And those online, those here, and on our subscription list and our participants, please expect to hear from us in terms of our thinking now about how to carry this forward in terms initially of a publication which gives due respect to the quality and the diversity of the material which we've been considering over the last few days. So that's how I'd like to take that forward. In some concluding reflections, and to leave us with some things important to think about and to reflect on our conversation, I'd now like to invite Pablo Andujosa to give a few of his own reflections, an active participant and always engaging with a wealth of his own experience in this area. So I really look forward, and I want to say thank you for your generous offer to say a few words. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be very brief. In many ways, Richard has distilled, I think, many of the thematics, the issues, the different visions, I think, that have come out from this, I'm sure, to Richard and to Alex, exhausting conference, which can be, in a sense, exhilarating. But conferences are never exhaustive. And I think what this conference has made us all realize is that there's so much else that one can think about. And Richard, I think, as I just said, has distilled this really, really very well. As many people who know me, I always look at things as much as I can historically and in terms of periodization. And what Richard said at the end there was regards to learning from the histories of resource nationalism, I think is really important. In some sense, to get the sense of the timing of why resource nationalism comes into the fore when it does. And I was reminded of that just now when Omar gave his presentation. Not that he was obviously unaware of the differences between the timings, but more what people aspire to in the different places where people come from. But I think it is important because I think there are layerings, both of different kinds of accumulation that take place in countries, but also how politicians themselves locate themselves as representatives of nations at given times. And it seems to me that one needs to understand the context within which there's a projection of how one utilizes resources for quote unquote nationalist purposes. I actually came to this conference with the idea that we should probably debunk and get rid of the notion of resource nationalism. In part because nationalism, as a student of nationalism, played itself out at different times very differently than what we'd understand nationalism to be today. And in fact, I invoke the idea of resource sovereignties rather than resource nationalism, and in part to get at the regionalism, the localism, the various scales at which people mobilize around the resources that are beneath them, surrounding them. And at the same time, they have to contest with the national entities that make a claim about nationalism for them. So if there's going to be a comparativism, it's not to get rid of something. It's almost Freudian. If you try to get rid of it, it'll come back in a nightmare, in the sense in which you don't get rid of the discourse of resource nationalism, but you're constantly aware of the contestations around the national itself. And this isn't a way of trying to diminish or get rid of the state, quite the contrary, but it's to acknowledge that the state is not the only site of the problem of the fiscal deficit, that it's not the only site of the way in which we understand where resources go to, even where it's the state that makes a claim upon where those resources go to. So if I can pick up upon what Richard said a moment ago about the redistributive side, we're all normative. We're all normative about this, and we want the best for those that in some ways are often excluded from and displaced because of the nature of the nationalism itself or the claims of the nationalist itself. So redistribution, but redistribution about what and where and for whom? And it seems to me that's where the question of sovereignty comes into play. And that's where the question, we must say, around where democracy comes into play. So if you're going to have a political economy of distribution, then you have to, if you pardon the expression, shift and reallocate the nature of the actors who make a claim, not stakeholding. If you forgive me, that's all part of the neoliberal discourse. But if you actually make a claim and valorize those people, those communities, those sites, those scales, who can then make claims themselves. So I was mindful again of Omar's presentation, but if you have a national organization that speaks to peoples wherever they are. So the nation, the national from below, then reshapes our understanding of how we can coordinate, not we, that sounds gratuitous in a way, but the peoples themselves. Just another couple of comments, and I just want to reemphasize the political one, because I don't think these things go away. And I think this is a matter of research, and I was mentioning this yesterday to Alex. When people do research, it's important to get those generational, intergenerational lens upon the nature of what's happening in the communities themselves. Because it is in the communities, it's of a place. All of us have to be geographers in this sense, right? And particularize the locations out of which places are extracted. The sites of accumulation for others, but not for the communities themselves. But those communities have some historical sense of the layerings of who accumulates, who are the beneficiaries, who are the peoples who extract and don't give back, right? So that's one thing. The second thing has to do, I think, with the disciplinary nature of the debates and the discussions themselves. And in the sense, to use the cliche going forward, whom one mobilizes as academics and as would-be policymakers, because I think most academics are not policymakers. In the sphere of things, they tend to be lawyers and they tend to be people in the business world. Political scientists and others tend to be on the margins of this, and sometimes we're called upon in consultancies and I have to say, Bonnie, as part of visions to participate in the legitimation sometimes of the processes themselves, even where one thinks that one is doing something good. And one is. I don't think one should renege on putting one's feet in to what's to be done, Richard. So I think that's important. But it's to what's to be done about alternatives and to think about what those alternatives in fact might be. And this conference has generated, as has, of course, the academic literature around this, alternatives, to think long term about what else we can do. We heard about livelihoods today from Ghana, right? The alternative livelihoods, but the livelihoods that have been displaced with the expectation that that which replaces it is somehow going to be better, right? So again, whom one mobilizes is important. One of the people who didn't come today was a sociologist of migration. And the people who are displaced by these extractions. So it's important to mobilize sociologists, just as it is important to know about people who have been on the ground for a long period of time, so that we know over time what is better and what is worse, right? We know over time that we can do the comparisons that are not 1 year, 2 years, but people who spend time with communities. So we have to mobilize anthropologists. We have to mobilize people who know these communities. And some of those anthropologists are in the communities themselves. The discourse in our areas is now called local knowledge, but we buttress that. We reinforce that with people who are of the discipline itself. The same goes, we should all kill the lawyers, but we need them, right? And because they are more proximate actually to the contracts that bring about these relationships, then it seems to me in a disciplinary and in another way, one needs lawyers on side to help us understand the contracts. Anyone who's looked at a contract knows there is a million footnotes that only lawyers can understand. So it's important to understand the contracts. It's important to understand the people who do work on this, to find out, just as we find out from sociologists of migration, who has been displaced and the reasons for displacement, all right? So also we need, as I said, people who over a longitudinal period have a much stronger, deeper sense empirically, as well as ethnologically, of what happens to communities. But of course, our disciplines of political science and development studies are also required in the context of understanding both the norms and practices of the expectations of development, but also the central conduits of the state to understand the sites of legislation and the sites of accumulation that national governments and regional governments make a claim for themselves. The final thing I'll finish off with, though, is I think is one of reinforcements, and I've said it already, but I think it's worthwhile again. I was very moved by one of the presentations that dealt with the community in Kenya. It was a very poignant reminder of that combination, it seems to me, of history, right? An earlier side of accumulation, a continuous side of accumulation, that despite independence, the government has taken up in Kenya. And all the discourses on corporate social responsibility, all the discourses on doing better, being good, the discourses of development, but also the discourses of exclusion were contained in that. And I found that amongst the many presentations here to be one of the most poignant because it coincided with presentations about alternatives and to think alternatively about how we understand both our construction of peoples who are in the places that these extractions take place, out of sight from the state, denuded, if you pardon the expression, by the state, but in some sense, not allowed to think of alternatives, even where in some tacit sense, they all had a sense of alternative from what the state, the historic state, the colonial state, and how they were constructed in a particular way. But secondly, how the post-colonial state also constructed them. All right, so there was a case study of thinking about alternatives from the ground up. But the broader ambit, it seems to me, and Richard has mentioned this, and the conferences I think has represented this really tremendously well, is to think comparatively, is to constantly think comparatively. So the combination of these histories, these communities and comparativism, it seems to me what the pith and the ethos of the conference was. And hopefully that's what everyone would take forward, that we learn from others, that we learn from other places, whether it's Latin America or whether it's Southeast Asia or whether it's Southeast Asia, that we learn from other places. So we start from where we know, and in your case, obviously it's Southern Africa, but we broaden it out because, as my late father would say, sometimes 10 insights are as good as a theory, and you derive insights from other places as well. Thank you very much.
For that inspiration and a call to arms and a challenge and a provocation all at the same time, which is your superpower. So thank you for that. A lot to think about. And I think maybe I can call upon you when it comes time to putting these words to paper, all of us to contribute as well. Thank you so much for those thoughtful words. I'd just like to wrap up now and close, and I'd like to close with a few words of thanks. First, to everyone here and those who've come a long way for this meeting, and those who have been with us the whole time on the internet. Thank you for making that effort, for coming forth to begin with and offering to talk about your work, and then for being here and engaging, being here so regularly. It's really been wonderful. So thanks to all of you first. I would like to thank the organizations which have paid for this conference and which have sponsored our work and continue to sponsor our work. And that's mainly the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada through a series of grants, including this. A large supporter of this meeting has been York University through the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I want to thank them, and Ravi DaCosta in particular, the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies, have been a very, very strong supporter of our African partnerships and continues to do so. In our next grant, York is giving almost $1 million, mostly in cash, to support not just our work and research assistance here, but the recruitment of postdocs and doctoral students and master students every year in 4 African countries. And I think that's remarkable and wonderful, and I'm glad they've done that. And our projects wouldn't exist without this kind of support. And my own department, politics here, has been equally supportive and welcoming, making space for past visitors and in the future visitors. So I want to thank them as well. I want to thank people who actually work at York, including our research assistants and our student volunteers, our technical wizard, Clay. Thank you so much. Made everything easier. And will maybe help us finding where these recordings are at some point so we can do something with this material. To our other media person, Asrun, Sareen, for helping us with our social media accounts. To Dinah for looking after us and registering us and running around and doing things for us. That's wonderful. Vivi, who I don't think is here at the moment. Oh, there she is at the back, always keeping an eye on everything and doing a good job, keeping things going straight. Thank you, Vivi. Stefan, who has been wonderful with our publications and editing and getting things formatted and together, overcoming all sorts of logistical issues. And of course, Alex, who is our PDG, has been our PDG coordinator, who took the lead in organizing this conference and who will continue to be in touch as the full-time project manager for our African extractivism project and challenges as we go forward. So thank you especially to Alex for all the work he's put in, late nights, weekends, and all of his intellectual contributions to the PDG over the 4 years of that project, including as a researcher, not just a coordinator. It's wonderful. Again, thank you everyone for your inputs, your time, your thoughts, your really careful consideration. We appreciate it. I think the meeting has worked because of that, and I really look forward to working with everyone as we move forward with this material. Thanks again, and safe travel home.